national slate of candidates and candidate for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. House of Representatives in Michigan's 11th District. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us live on the internet for this very special event. You are joining a two-location conference simulcast event taking place here in Detroit, Michigan, and in coordination with the campaign of Rachel Brown, who is hosting an event in Boston, Massachusetts. We are gathered under rather extraordinary international circumstances. The escalation toward a confrontation between the United States on the one hand and the nations of Russia and China in what would necessarily be a thermonuclear war, if launched, is fast accelerating. There's been ample resistance from top ranks of our US military against the type of actions against Syria and Iran, which would provide the pretext for this World War III scenario. However, we are now seeing President Obama acting as a puppet of the British Empire, stoking the fires of conflict with North Korea and pressing a deployment of missile systems in cooperation with Australia, South Korea, and Japan, obviously targeting China. Mr. LaRouche, who joins us today, has been he's been very outspoken since the beginning of President Obama's administration about the clinical mental state of our president and the need to remove him constitutionally in order to avoid the destruction of our nation. The future of our nation right now, should we act to avoid this destruction, lies in the return to the tradition of John F. Kennedy and FDR, which Lyndon LaRouche has unquestionably been the living thread of continuity for the revival of that constitutional tradition today. So without any further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Yes, thank you very much. I shall actually say to you now something which I reported to the relevant meeting earlier this morning, that with the problem we have now in the organization is the fact that the California part of the organization was cut out of the general pattern because of special arrangements, which we're now taking steps to correct. But the point is that the issue here is this. We are on the verge of both a general warfare, thermonuclear warfare, which has to be prevented because it would mean the virtual extinction of the human species, maybe not entirely, but virtually, which is about to be launched by Obama on behalf of the British monarchy. That's the way it goes. What was needed to be done right now, as I said this morning, we've got to get California properly integrated back into our operation, because the operation is as follows. We need an immediate action which is to restore our economy to its original intention, to a fixed exchange rate system. And on that basis, we can be assured that this nation would survive. But it will not survive unless we first of all establish a proper fixed exchange rate system. In our tradition, we will not survive. And so we're now at the point where if that does not occur, we're finished. Now, the key thing we're going to do for this purpose is we're going to establish a fixed exchange rate system based on our tradition. That system will be a fixed exchange rate system back to our original Constitution, and that's where we will go. We will follow with that the following procedure. What we must do first in action is we must establish a fixed exchange rate system as a policy. That is a national system, a fixed exchange rate system as a policy. We will also put in the Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is absolutely essential to prepare the way for a fixed exchange rate system. And we are going to, in that case, eliminate the other kinds of problems. But the key thing that's going to make this thing work is we're now in the process of launching a NWAPA program. The NWAPA program, which is we're now prepared in terms of design to go with, that program will be the recovery program of the United States and will be the assurance of the existence of our United States. So it's a three-part program. Number one, we must reestablish a fixed exchange rate system, the original system of the United States. We must precede that by the installation of Glass-Steagall, because, and finally, with this program, we must set into motion a recovery of the nation with this package, as I mentioned. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, so that is exactly what we must do. Now we have a problem in California. We're going to have to fix the problem in California because this means that our candidates, our leading 6 candidates, will not be treated as individual candidates as such. They will be individual candidates for election in the general election this coming election. But they will also at the same time be a team which puts through the reorganization of the national economic system of the United States to a fixed exchange rate system, a credit system. And that will be the foundation. In order to get the credit system into order, we have to, first of all, reestablish Glass-Steagall. That means we will eliminate the greatest part of the federal debt of the United States today, which is a gambling debt. And under Glass-Steagall, as under the original Constitution, the United States does not pay gambling debts of banks or anything else. That's the key part. So, the other part of the thing is that once we establish Glass-Steagall, we will eliminate the obligations to the banks, the kind of banks, the swindle banks, that are looting the U.S. population. Those banks will be, those forms of banking will be locked out of federal responsibility, which means we will have banks which are functioning like under a Glass-Steagall system. That will not be enough in order to save this economy. That is, Glass-Steagall will, by eliminating debts which should not be paid, which are contrary to our Constitution, will save the nation and prevent the general collapse which is now ongoing, the blowout. However, it will not be enough. Therefore, we have to go back to a fixed exchange rate system as our international policy, but we have to go back to the original system of our Constitution. That will ensure, a credit system will ensure our ability to launch major projects which will lead to an actual general recovery. Without that reform, you cannot effect a general recovery of the U.S. economy now. And on that basis, then we will launch a massive amount of credit, and the keystone of all this credit launching will be NWAPA. The NWAPA program will be the major prompting program for the recovery of the United States under our Constitution. Therefore, everything we're going to do should be centered on these two things. Two are constitutional. Glass-Steagall is constitutional in its character, and the cancellation of it was a crime against the nation. That's out of our original Constitution. Going to a fixed exchange rate type of system in terms of other nations, and going to the original constitutional system of the United States would mean a general recovery for the United States. These are the measures which must be taken. Without these measures, this nation does not have a chance of surviving. With these measures, we can do just fine. And so I think, with that said, this old geezer saying this, is where we stand. You probably have a lot of questions to ask, and I'll respond to them.
Okay, we'll start with questions here on this end. Who's got a question?
Oh, hi, my name is Samuel Parlett. I read your book, Earth's Next 50 Years, and you talk a lot about scientific development, improving our economy, and all that stuff. Do you think it would be a good idea for private corporations to start mining on the moon and getting a resource? Earth doesn't have a lot of helium, and we could make helium nuclear power plants? Or do you think only NASA could do such a...
Well, we do need some programs which will be, in a sense, private. They'll be auxiliary, however.
Yeah.
The only way we can manage a program of the type we require is really a full federal program. It will be actually not only a federal program, but it will be a cooperative program with other nations involved in this project. For example, right now you have a situation.
Yeah.
If at any point that a very large piece of rock were to hit the planet Earth, say in the North Pole region, it is probable that the entire population of the United States would, and of the world as a whole would disappear. We're not sure of that. So therefore, the need to go back to a full NASA program, but a NASA program extended to that purpose, the colonization, the intended colonization of Mars, but also a program which has been proposed also by Russia, of cooperation among nations to provide protection of the planet Earth against large rocks or other kinds of catastrophes which might hit the planet Earth. At present, the people of the United States, the people of the world, have no present protection against such existing threats. So there also we have the other problems in the solar system, things that we have to attend to. So we need to begin to get into a full program of development in terms of nearby space, going at first into the Mars region, the inner side of the planetary system. And there are many other things that this is needed for. That driver program is what should drive us, is what should determine the future of our nation. Private programs, as such, will not work. Only a full-scale federal and global program can do anything of what's necessary. With the combination of a space program, that is the restoration of NASA, for example, and the development of the NAWAPA, these two factors, as the key factors in the U.S. economy, will ensure a general early recovery of the United States economy and will provide a system for the future of mankind going into, say, some centuries to come. And we can expect, beneficial results fairly soon. Some more modest, some more copious, some more serious. But that's what's needed. This kind of driver program, with NAWAPA as the Earth-based side of this program, and then the other features, the space program, the restoration of NASA, and similar kinds of programs to a full scale. These are the measures which are absolutely essential. Without that, we are in trouble. The human race is in trouble.
That's my question. Thank you.
Now where's at McDonald's? I know.
After the Kennedy assassination, why didn't future presidents and Congresses...
What? The question was not clear from here. It's an audio problem.
Boss
Was it on? Oh, again, I have to say it. After the Kennedy assassination, why didn't our future presidents and Congresses take up the Alaska waterworks? They're very interested in oil, but nobody
Well, the point was, this was
taken care of.
the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was essentially a treasonous act. To the best of my knowledge, the assassination of President Kennedy was organized formally from Europe, through by way of Mexico. And the assassins, who were really of French pedigree, French-Spanish pedigree, quickly got out of there and left the remains of the situation to be covered over. But the assassination of Kennedy had a purpose. Remember that John F. Kennedy was prompted to become a presidential candidate by Eleanor Roosevelt. Her commitment was to the her commitment was to actually continue and resume the intention of President Roosevelt. And John F. Kennedy accepted that honor and did a great job for the United States. But there were other people in the United States and also in the British Empire which had a contrary view. Their intention was, first of all, to crush the kind of development program which Kennedy was developing, and implicitly NWAPA as well, and also to get the United States involved in wars overseas which would bring the United States down into a state of weakness which would please the British and some of the British lovers inside the United States. So we went into, Kennedy had opposed the Indochina War. He had been backed by General Douglas MacArthur and implicitly supported by General Eisenhower, the former president. What we've done since that time, since the assassination of Kennedy and the cover-up of the actual assassination, the United States has been taken down consistently, year by year, to the present time. There has never been a period of actual net gain in the development of the U.S. economy in terms of the economic effect of it since that time. We are now on the verge of being destroyed by a form of hyperinflation driven by international forces, which unless we junk this thing, the United States is now finished. Now the problem is that the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, is a total British agent. Obama. He's also an evil person, as I've made clear a number of times, and I've had the evidence to prove it. So under the influence of Obama, in cooperation with his masters in London, the United States is being destroyed and the world is being destroyed. We're now on the verge of a thermonuclear war, which is threatened to break out. It was already threatened late last year. It's still there. Since the assassination of of Libya's president, which was an assassination. He was taken captive, and while they had him in captivity, they shot him and killed him. It's a murder. And the intention was to go immediately into warfare in Libya, not only in Libya, but in the Middle East, including Tehran, so we've been hovering under that. We've had people, such as many of our leading general officers in the United States, those circles, have fought to resist the United States being engaged in a war in Syria and in Iran. Because such a war in either Syria or Iran would set the United States into a trap which would probably lead into a thermonuclear war involving the United States as well as Russia, China, and other nations. It is not certain that the human species would outlive the effects of such a war, because such a war would not be an ordinary war. It would be using thermonuclear weapons, a bombardment from which whole sections of this planet could not survive. The major source of these weapons to be used is actually the United States. The Ohio submarines, which are capable of launching the most destructive force that humanity has ever heard of. Now, the United States does not want that war in general. The leading generals of the United States in similar circles have fought to resist that, prevent that war from being launched. But we're still sitting, as many people in Washington could tell you if they wanted to, that we're on the edge of exactly such a war. That is, it starts by something with Syria and with Iran. That involves alliances which these two countries have with Russia and other countries. There's already a lineup for a thermonuclear war where the United States would, under British direction, would start the war by a bombardment with thermonuclear missiles. And would follow it up, of course, then with Russia and other nations which were being attacked by U.S. and British forces and so forth, would fire back. Now, when you take the number and magnitude of the weapons which are involved in this, there is a question as to whether the human species would survive such a war. For that reason, leading general officers and others of the United States, and with opinions shared with other countries, says that this must not happen. What started with Libya must not be continued. And we all know that if Obama is not impeached, is not removed from office because of his mental problems, that war will probably occur. And now some of us, I'm involved in this, some of us know this and are determined to prevent this, including leading responsible figures of the United States institutions, including people in Russia, including China, including India. We are opposed to allowing this to happen. But if this psychotic, who's called our president, Obama, remains in office, it is highly probable that the British monarchy will push him into such a war. That does not mean that the British are simply looking for a war. What the British intention is, and they made it very clear, the intention is, as we see in Europe, is to eliminate the institution of the sovereign nation state. The intention is to bring the world under the control of the British Empire. As we've already seen in Europe, the nations of Western and Central Europe, generally, do not have any sovereignty. They're under a system in which no nation in that part of Europe has any sovereignty anymore. So the intention is actually to set up a system which makes the whole world an extended British Empire, period. That's a fact. That's not an opinion. That's a cold fact, and the British say so, and others say so. So we're now in a situation where we were trying to defend not only the existence of the United States against this trap. And we should remember also, from the time that John F. Kennedy was murdered, assassinated, the United States has been perpetually involved in a permanent series, ongoing series of long wars in many parts of the world, especially in the Asian region, but other areas as well. And if we don't stop this, civilization is finished. So right now what we have is that if Obama remains president, it is almost virtually certain that our military and other relevant people who are opposed to this war will not be able to override a declaration of war by our president. A declaration of war by our president, which will not be an open, it won't be an open announcement. It will be a secret announcement, announced after it's happened. And then the counter effects will then come on. So therefore, that's what we're up against. It means that if we don't get this president out of there soon, and there are perfectly legal reasons for removing him, he's clinically insane. He's violated many violations of our Constitution. He could be pulled out as a mental case. There's a provision for that in our Constitution. Or he can be impeached and suspended by impeachment. Unless these measures occur, or such measures occur, we are headed now for a highly probable thermonuclear war which will obliterate most of the population of this planet. The British view is if everybody submits to the British on this order, they don't have to throw the weapons. But their intention is that if the United States and other nations resist going to this war, the British will launch it through using Obama as a tool for doing so, using the fact that he's president and could override a military opposition to such a war. That's where we stand. That's the reality which confronts us.
Hello, Lynn.
Hi.
I have been talking with a lot of people about the need for Glass-Steagall and the Hamiltonian credit system and the national bank, et cetera. Most people still follow the line that they get out of the news media. News media does not talk about the futures market. They use the term speculators now in a very high level. A lot of people still believe that there's a stabilization in speculation. And I'm maintaining to them that only through the credit system can farmers and manufacturers achieve parity. Now, where can I get this cleared up with talking with them so that they understand that any type of speculation, and I maintain including futures market, will not work as far as getting the parity across to the manufacturing and the farm production?
I don't think that any competent person who has any competence whatsoever in economy would have any defense against Glass-Steagall. It's impossible. Not restoring Glass-Steagall would be an act of insanity. Look, for example, let's look at our system now. Look at Wall Street. Do you realize that this whole system of the United States, as long as we do not enact Glass-Steagall, the United States is hopelessly bankrupt? Do you think that there's anything to cover the debt of the Federal Reserve System? There's nothing. Do you think that Europe or Britain, the British themselves, have any margin for actually covering their debt? Do you think that the situation of the United States and of Britain and of most of continental Europe is any better than the case of Germany in 1923 with hyperinflation? We are all living in both the transcontinental region. We're all living under the greatest rate of hyperinflation that the planet has ever known. These debts will never be paid because they never could be paid. They are vast and there's nothing to cover them. The only way to do it is to go to Mr. Speculator, the crooked banker, the Wall Street type, and say, gentlemen, you have your debts. You own your debts, but we don't pay any of them. Now that would mean simply a very practical measure. We don't pay, the United States Constitution does not pay gambling debts. If you've got a gambling debt, kiss it goodbye, or don't kiss it goodbye, probably a better idea. Huh? Just get rid of it. Never pay it. The United States is not to be destroyed by foreign debts which are gambling debts. So Glass-Steagall is a set. Without Glass-Steagall, this nation cannot continue to exist. Anyone who is not putting Glass-Steagall foremost is either insane or criminal, because there's no way this nation can continue to exist under those conditions. Now you say these guys are going to go bankrupt. Well, not all going to go bankrupt, because what we will do with Glass-Steagall, obviously, is you will divide the debts in banks into two categories. One category, which is our traditional banking. Those accounts in those banks, which are not this crooked type, those honest debts will be covered by federal guarantees, as under Glass-Steagall originally. But other kinds of debts, gambling debts, will not be covered by the federal government. So that means that to go to these systems, we're not going to pay them. We're going to defend the banking system, that is the commercial banking system of the United States, as we used to under Franklin Roosevelt. We'll continue to do that. The problem is this: there will be not enough wealth left in the banking system, even after we clean it up and stabilize it. Well, it won't be enough to keep the nation going. So therefore, we have to do something else. We have to go back to our original system of a credit system under the Alexander Hamilton, for example, banking system. Under those systems, we can issue credit, not deposit, not banking deposit, but credit, U.S. federal credit. And that federal credit will be used to launch large-scale programs, of which the typical example would be what we're going to do with NWAPA. We obviously are going to completely restore the intention of our space system. That must be restored. We need it, because we need defense against the things that threaten humanity from nearby space. We do have the knowledge of the technology which is required to do that. So we must defend NASA, restore it and defend it. But the key thing is we've got to create a project which is big enough to, under a credit system, big enough to save the U.S. economy and get growth going again. You realize, most of you, that we no longer have any industry in the United States to speak of. It's been shut down. When the auto industry went under, that was it. It blew everything out. We were working on this thing at the time when the crisis came in the auto back some years ago. And we counted all the space that was controlled by the automobile companies, all the potentialities there and related companies. And we had a map that, with a federal program designed for this purpose, we could have maintained a diminished auto industry. The debt was too much. But by transferring the production capability from the auto industry, which we had too much capacity on, and transfer it to other industries, which we need, for which we had the floor space, we had the people with the skills and the technology skills who could be brought back into play, we could have had a revival of our industrial might in the United States. That has now been destroyed under Bush and under this president. So therefore, what we need is a project which will take us out of this whole problem. NWAPA is the greatest project ever attempted by mankind. NWAPA is fully designed. There are changes that would be added to the process now, but NWAPA would be a full revival of the industrial and related potential of the U.S. economy. It would also be a major focus of cooperation with other nations. It would mean the restoration of this nation. It would mean that the unemployment will stop, that what's happening to our people will stop. We're going back into a real economy of the kind we used to have before John F. Kennedy was assassinated and a bunch of characters up there covered up the assassination. And also, John F. Kennedy would not allow the war in Indochina, nor would he have allowed the other wars in which we're throwing our citizens as cannon fodder just to be murdered for perpetual wars in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. We have in our power as citizens, if we mobilize as citizens, we have the power to prevent the threatened thermonuclear war, which is hovering over humanity as a whole right now. We also have the understanding, the design, and the resources, which if we mobilize, we can rebuild this nation and rebuild other nations in similar kinds of problems. This is a choice for us as citizens, that we as citizens must mobilize to take charge of our nation once again. by a popular demand for those measures which will solve this problem. And we have in Nawaba, we have the greatest project that ever attempted on this planet. It is essentially designed, it has been designed to go for decades now. And it's been improved upon by our people who've been working on the improvements in the design necessary to bring the whole thing up to date. The greatest project that has ever been attempted on this planet is Nawaba. And we're in a position, if we get this bum out of the White House and get a different program going, Nawaba can be the key to an economic revival, not only of the United States, but other parts of the world, which can solve the essential problem that faces us today.
Lynn, I have a question for you. Do you see the connection in principle between the tuning of the biosphere with Nawaba and the tuning of a choir? Could there be intentions that are common with both music and Nawaba?
Yes, there are. It's obvious that the creative powers of the human mind and the creative powers of classical musical composition are very closely related, so that the one is harmonious with the other. And if you have good musicians, you'll find you'll get better technicians.
Okay, we got a question sent in from Napoleon, Ohio. He wants to know, Lynn, what your stance is on this Coney 2012 propaganda movie. He says that he sees it as a psyop to commence a UN invasion of Africa. He wants to know your thoughts on that.
I think that's a fairly good estimate, or fear, should we say, because that's the intention. Africa is entirely a British imperial colony. That's a fact. It's also a font of genocide against the people of Africa. It's been going on for a very long time. It's been done, the greatest rate of this thing is done by the British Empire, and it is a British Empire. And obviously, as human beings, if we are human beings and not animals dressed up as something, then we know that the injustice, the mass murder that's been still in progress against the people of Africa is a clear indication of what is the essential evil throughout this planet. The fact that this is allowed to occur, that the cover-ups of systemic murder, mass murder, are allowed, indicates that the nations which allow this to go on, especially the British Empire, but also in France, the same thing, other parts of the world, similar things. Essentially, Africa is a British colony. In fact, if you get underneath the surface and find out who really owns what and who owns this sort of thing. No, this is obvious. And this is the one thing that, the most obvious thing in terms of humanity. If we do not stop the genocide conducted against Africa under the leadership of the British Empire in particular, we will not have the morality needed to guide us in any part of the great enterprises of this planet.
Hi, I'm Arthur LaPlante, and as this whole project is a symphony of many as a symphony of many people with notes, to one objective to bring humanity up a scale. It's like there's hecklers in the audience with this British Empire, where they're taking us down in our health system, our food system, and our energies. Could you address that?
Yes, the intention of the British Empire, and I do mean the British Empire, and I do mean the Queen herself, and the whole retinue of that bunch. Their intention and declared intention is to reduce the population of this planet, the human population, from approximately 7 billion people now to less than 1 billion people as soon as possible. It's a policy of genocide. It's the genocide problem is also known as the green policy. You will observe that since Teddy Roosevelt, who was a no-good bum, whose uncle trained him, and his uncle was the chief spy for the Confederacy, and he trained his son. So that racist crew, typified by them, did that. So that's what the Green Movement was. Now the Green Movement means no jobs. Look around you. Tell me what factories were closed, what industries were closed. Tell me what was done to agriculture under current agricultural policies through the federal government. Tell me what happened to those industries. Tell me what countries we get our foodstuffs from, our machine tool materials. It's all taken away from us. We're on a green policy. And a green policy, I'll tell you what the lesson to take is. You know, there was a long time ago, we had some dinosaurs. And those dinosaurs all died out one day, very quick, because they were not fit to live. And the same thing is being done to us. Our people are being turned into dinosaurs who lack the conditions and even the mental conditions in which to secure their own lives. This crime called environmentalism, if you don't eliminate that crime as it stands now, many of you are not going to be living a year from now. Because what we have in the central states of the United States, the agricultural states, we have a general collapse of food production, partly because of the stormy weather we had earlier this year and last year. We're not going to have crops in these areas. It's not there. The whole sections, look at say beef in Texas. Look at grains in the central states. Look at the way the water systems are managed right now, the shortages. We're not going to have the means to exist unless we get rid of this green policy, which was brought to us by a president who was not a good Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was the British agent trained by his uncle, who was an outstanding British agent for the Confederacy, and who did everything possible from the time that Teddy Roosevelt became president. He did everything possible to put the United States on a green policy, which has been a trend to drive us down into disaster ever since. So they've got two problems. One, we don't have the commitment to reviving the agriculture and the industry which we need to keep even our own people alive. And this year, this coming spring, is going to be one of the greatest disasters the United States has ever experienced in terms of relative food supplies, unless we can do something to change that now. So that's where we stand. Yes, we can do much about this. We can solve a lot of problems. But we have to find the will, and we have to find a new leadership inside our government to restore our constitutional system and put us back on production. Look at around you. Look at the young people, say between 12 and 18 or more so years of age. Look at what their situation is and think back what the situation was one generation ago or two generations ago. What's happened to those young people, those young men and women, say from 12 years of age or 14 years of age up? What's their condition? What's happening to them? What's happening to our farmers? What's happening to our food supply? What's happening to our industry? What's happening to our health care? And all of this has been done to us by our own government since the time that we had the last real president in office. We had 2 Bushes, and they weren't burning bushes, and we had this current presidency. And these have been the greatest disasters which the United States has ever experienced. And it's hitting us now. So therefore, we have a reason to mobilize, and it's, as the citizens have to mobilize, we also need institutions of leadership in government which will get back their guts and do the things that have to be done. We're in a disaster. Civilization itself is in a disaster. We could be the extermination of the human species, even with these kinds of conditions I've mentioned. But we've got to stop sitting back and hoping that somebody is going to relieve us of this problem. We've got to take charge. We've got to mobilize our fellow citizens to see what we have to do and do it. The means exist. The programs exist. NWOPA is an example of this. NWOPA can be the actual leader of the revival of the United States. It's the greatest single project that mankind has ever undertaken. The design is there. It can be started. It may take us 20, 30 years to get the job done, but it will work, and it will be growth all the way. There are other measures that can be taken. We've got to, as a people, revive ourselves and stop waiting for leadership from people who are not leaders, and just demand that we know what it is that can be done. And there's a lot that we do know that can be done.
Hello, I was wondering, what are we going to do to change our culture? Like, we have these environmentalists, we have these Kill Coney cult now, and we have a bunch of our youth in the universe of mindlessness and just being on Facebook and not in reality. How do we change our culture, our society, and make it better?
Well, I recall a time when things were not quite as bad as they are today. That was called the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I can tell you that things were much better there then than they are in most parts of the United States today. Because at least we had our brains. And that's something they've tried to take away from us in recent years. So it's up to us and to recognize that we have, in the United States, we may have kids on the street who are just nothing right now. They're practically destroyed people. And it's intentional. I mean, the conditions that exist among young people who are virtually destroyed, drugs and have all the other things that go with it. 12-year-old kids who are actually becoming murderers out of hysteria and desperation, with no opportunities to face them. People living on the streets in those years' age groups. We let that happen. We could fix it. We don't fix it because we're showing respect for our great leaders, our great misleaders, especially since about 2000, when things really began to get bad. So therefore, we can do something about it, but we have to decide we do have to do something about it. You don't have to do something really drastic. You don't have to do something silly. All we have to do is look up at these politicians who want to be politicians and others, and who are officials, and say, come on, cut the crap. This is the situation we face. You know we face it. You know what can be done to stop it. If you have the guts to deal with those politicians who you let sit on you and prevent you from doing things that you know you should work for. We've got to get our guts back. And the reason you don't get your guts back is because you don't have confidence in most of your politicians. you don't think there's anybody in City Hall, or especially in the state government, or in the national government, that you can trust, whether in the Senate or the House of Representatives. There are very few that you could actually trust to put their neck out, put themselves at risk to save this nation and save these people. And the only thing we can do is raise that kind of fuss and start to mobilize one another to insist that the right thing be done, the right policies. First thing is throw this bum that's called the president out of office. It's a very simple thing. He's committed the treason. He's committed the violations. He's insane. And insanity is a good reason to throw a president out of office. This guy's insane. And he's not also evil. He's a mass murderer. He's impeachable. He's violated the Constitution again and again and again. And yet people still sit back there and say, you got to respect him, he's president. Such presidents we throw out of office. And we have constitutional ways of doing it.
Hi, Lynn. I have a technical question for you in regards to the fixed exchange rate system. If you could put a little detail into how that would work, you know, in the framework of the global program of NWAPA and the space mission.
Well, it's elementary that we've had a long delusion in humanity, because humanity as we know it, that is, we know it from records and so forth, is largely based on a fixed exchange, is based on a monetary system, a monetarist system. It's called the oligarchical principle. And it's always been wrong. We had, for example, in the case of Massachusetts in the middle of the 17th century, we had a system in Massachusetts. And that system in Massachusetts operated on a currency which the state at that time created, arrangement, and that system worked just fine until the British came in and crushed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that was the end of it. But it didn't die because people who were crushed in Massachusetts, someone like Benjamin Franklin, moved down into Pennsylvania and places like that, and led in the fight to establish the intention of the Massachusetts Bay Colony again. And it was done. It was done by the war, a revolutionary war, to save us. It was done by the creation of our Constitution. It was done by leaders like Hamilton in particular, who gave us the kind of system we needed to deal with our money problems. And it worked, except it was taken away by a bum like, a couple of bums. Other ones we had, like Jackson. Jackson was a bum. Jackson was the guy who actually was the hatchet man to shut down our credit system. And we never recovered until after Lincoln's death. We never recovered from that. And yet people praise Jackson today. That shows you what fools there are out there. They don't know anything about Andrew Jackson. They still think he's a hero. He never was. He was a bum. He's a virtual traitor. But we have the ability, if we have the guts to do so, as a collection of citizens, to make our voices heard and not to give in to bunk and crazy systems that don't work. It's just up to us. I mean, we are human. We're individual human beings. And our system, the government, is based on essentially the consent of the people. And the consent of the people means that their agreement to what they consider reasonable things when reasonable ideas are presented to them. What's happened, we've given up our rights as citizens. We've let others impose themselves upon us. And that's why we're suffering. I mean, if we got out there at any one time with any number of us who feel these things, and just were out there saying, we demand this be changed, it would be changed. The problem, they have us intimidated. That people who know this is wrong, who know these conditions are wrong, feel isolated, alone, abandoned, feeling their neighbors will not back them up. And therefore they sit there and suffer and suffer and suffer. and do almost nothing to defend themselves.
Hi, Lynn. We have another question that was sent in from a contact who was not able to make it. He's from Wyandotte, and his name is Joe. And though you already addressed this, I think maybe you want to seize the opportunity to continue to push the issue. He says, how is the NWAPA going to affect Detroit and the Midwest? NWAPA is benefiting the West Coast, but how does that benefit anyone here who doesn't just pick up and move out west to work on the project?
How many train and railway systems do you think are going to be required throughout the United States, as in Detroit, for example, Michigan generally, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois? How many places that used to build automobiles and airplanes and things like that, machine tool design equipment? Do you think that NWAPA, which is apparently largely in the western part of the United States, up into Canada and up into Alaska, do you think that they're going to do this all by themselves? Where do you think you got the machine tool? We've got people in Detroit, we've got people in Ohio, we've got people in other places who are virtually running out of the age group that they can still do machine tool design. But they're still there. And they may not be able to work as hard as they used to, but they have the brains and knowledge to know how to teach others how to do it. What NWAPA will be over a period of, say, up to 30 years, 20 to 30 years, will be the greatest project you ever saw, and every part of the United States will be involved in it. There's no section of the United States that would not benefit immensely from the installation and development of the NWAPA program. It's the greatest project which has ever been attempted by any nation, including our own. And it would mean the immediate revival of the United States to what it once was, and better.
Are there any dangers to this large water project, such as we had large rainfall in Ohio here a few years ago, and Findlay was underwater, and Bluffton, Ohio was spared because there was a large stone quarry that took in some of the water. Would you install like buffers or anything of that nature when you have a large amount of water being moved?
Absolutely. Look what happened in Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a miniature version of the kind of approach done then under President Franklin Roosevelt, which is what NWAPA represents. But NWAPA is a much larger scale. It's the entire territory of this nation is involved. And this goes down to Mexico, northern Mexico. It goes into Canada. It's an international project. It's the greatest water management project ever conceived by mankind. The greatest projects we ever did are miniatures compared to NWAPA. It's the greatest water control and rearrangement system that was ever conceived of.
Massachusetts has a question.
Hi, Glenn. Paul Barron. You stated a couple of weeks ago when Benjamin Netanyahu was here to see President Obama that they had a secret agreement that President Obama would back Israel. Just this week I read in the New York Times that Netanyahu and the defense minister Barak has come to an agreement that they do need to strike Iran. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, there's no such need whatsoever. This was a British operation. These guys are British stooges. That's all they are. The majority of people that I respected in Israel, who some of them are still alive there, would have opposed this nonsense as insanity. But the British interest, which controls these guys, owns them, like Netanyahu, is not nothing but a puppet of the British. So he, with the backing of various interests, including Saudi interests, for example, are involved in trying to get this thing going. But the majority of the leadership I know in Israel, which is reasonable, they're not always reasonable, but they're reasonable on this question, know that this is insanity, the worst thing you could possibly do. But so the point is, this should never happen. And we hope that they would throw Netanyahu. The guy is no good anyway. He should have been thrown out by the Israelis, because he's, as many of them know, he's a threat to the average Israeli. His operation is a threat. They have no need to be involved in getting involved in a major thermonuclear war. And that's what this is. The Israelis may not have thermonuclear weapons, they have nuclear weapons. But they have no interest in such an adventure. They're only British puppets. And the problem, I don't know how hard some of the people I know about in Israel have fought against them, but I know they fought against them. And this thing should not be tolerated at all. You can imagine, if this were to happen, and most of our leading generals know this, as well as other relevant people, if you were to make an attack on Iran by Israeli forces, do you know what would happen? What countries would be involved? Do you know what kinds of weapons would be involved? Not just by the Israeli forces, but by others. Do you know what the alliances are throughout Asia? Do you know that what happens is this will come as a surprise attack? In other words, somebody's not going to declare war and then march troops in and then start to act. They will not tell you when the attack is to occur. They will not tell you. You will have no control over it. You have a president of the United States who's behind this, under British direction. The British are running it. You will not be told. What will happen then is you will have a concatenate, once the first weapons are fired, and they will be thermonuclear weapons. Not just nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons. And the United States has the greatest concentration of these thermonuclear weapons in submarines. When these things go off, they will go off against targets including Russia and China and possibly India, probably India. What do you think is going to happen then? The minute those things go off, and somebody detects that this is out beyond what's controllable, then you're going to have a reaction by the targeted nations, including nations which are also thermonuclear powers. Do you know how much killing is done in a war which the United States is involved in, where thermonuclear weapons are involved and others? Do you know how much of this planet will survive, or maybe not survive, if that thing starts? Do you realize what's being done by the U.S. military command in trying to postpone this since last year? And they're not sure how long they're going to be able to hold out against precisely this operation, which our President of the United States is behind. And the intention is to get the United States, under this president, to support this war. Such a war started with thermonuclear weapons may not leave many living human beings on this planet, if any. That's why people are concerned about this thing. They realize what the potential is. And you see what happened in Libya to Gaddafi. The Gaddafi model is the model for this kind of approach. And it was done by this president, who committed a crime in launching that war. So those are the terms you have to consider. We have a president who is prepared to unleash unlawful warfare, putting the United States itself in jeopardy by that act, involving Israel in this as a puppet to set the thing off. If it's set off and the target is Russia and China, and also implicitly India and other places. If that occurs, then obviously the U.S. naval forces and other forces are going to launch an attack on Russia and China with thermonuclear weapons. The minute those weapons are detected as launched, Russia and China will respond with thermonuclear weapons. The planet will explode with that nuclear and thermonuclear weapons and other things. That's what this is. That's what's at stake with Netanyahu as the trigger man for thermonuclear World War III.
Okay, Lynn, I think you've given people a lot to think about. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I apologize for my little problem at the beginning of the thing. I was had a terrible headache, and when we started, then I got back in shape. But that's that. But you've heard what I've said. You know what I've intended. I think I made myself clear. The key thing I would say is a theme. We're now in possession of the knowledge of what has to be done. There are three things to bear in mind at this point. Number one, we have to install Glass-Steagall. If you do not install Glass-Steagall now, kiss the United States and yourself goodbye, because you don't have a chance unless Glass-Steagall is involved. Now, Glass-Steagall has limited capabilities now because there's so little left of the legitimate banking system, even if we protect it, that it will not give us the means to restore the economy of the United States. And people will die of hunger and other problems as a result. Therefore, we cannot stop with Glass-Steagall. We must instantly install Glass-Steagall and accept no opposition to it. If you care about your life, if you care about this nation, you will insist that every politician in relevance will either support Glass-Steagall or run away and hide someplace and not be seen again for a long time. Because that will be the effect. You can have a general breakdown crisis of the United States economy modeled on what happened to Germany in 1923, a hyperinflation. That's ready to blow out. Therefore, this must be installed. Anyone who is not supporting Glass-Steagall should be impeached for failing to do so. All right. Now, Glass-Steagall has limited capabilities because we have limited surviving capabilities for handling this problem. The only way we can get enough money, or the equivalent of money, to save the U.S. economy under these conditions is to go to a credit system, which is what the original U.S. constitutional system was. The reestablishment of a credit system means that we will be able to generate sufficient wealth in terms of investment wealth in order to revive the U.S. economy. That would mean largely, you have two things. NWAPA obviously has to be restored because it's strategically crucial that NASA be restored. But the big project is NWAPA. And the combination of a national credit system and NWAPA will be the greatest surge of revival for the U.S. economy ever imaginable. So we have in our hands the things, NWAPA, the revival, going to the credit system as such, and the program of NASA. These projects will do it. We can save this nation. And there's nothing else much worth doing unless that's done.
Okay, Lynn, thanks for joining us today. Everyone, join me in thanking Lynn. we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we will go to Boston. We'll go to Rachel Brown.
Okay, please stand by, everyone, for Sky Shields, who will be coming up next. Please stand by if you are watching this live on the internet. Thank you. If you are attending via live broadcast over the LaRouchePAC TV, please stand by. We will be starting within the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, welcome to our new attendees and also to the gathering in Detroit, Michigan with Bill Roberts' campaign, as well as our international watchers. I'm glad to introduce a member of LaRouche's basement science team, Sky Shields, who has been doing work for the last couple of years in creating a revolution in science, especially as it applies to human economy. So I'd just like to ask one question before Sky begins. He's going to take up some of the questions of NWAPA as applied to different areas of human economy. But one question I'd like to ask is, so the hands on the clock point to 3:11. Is that the time? Hands on the clock may point to 3:19. But what time is it? Now for Sky.
Okay, so we'll play around today. I'll give an overview, sort of summary of some of the work we've been doing recently. Some of these elements of this you may have seen on the recent weekly reports. I'm going to try and condense it in a certain way that we can get to the point that Mr. LaRouche has been making recently about he says the idea that you want to start to view the universe from in an inverted fashion from the way people are used to viewing the universe. And the way I like it, sort of the image that I like it's best that conjures it is if people have ever read Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, which is the dialogue at Plato dying, the last discussion that he has with, that Socrates dying, last discussion that Socrates has with his students. And in it, he has a very funny line that I like a lot, where he's talking to all of his students about what mind is and what's the actual nature of mind. And his student, I forget which one, is the one who asks him, you know, well, what do you mean by mind, et cetera? And he says, well, for instance, I was very disappointed to read a book by Anaxagoras, which said that it was going to discuss the whole physical universe, all physical reality, but from the standpoint of mind. It was going to discuss what causes were. But then I read it, and it was just full of all kinds of ridiculous things. And then one of the students asked him, well, what sorts of ridiculous things do you mean? And he said, well, it had things like the idea that one could become two by adding one to it. And it had things like that said things like a man can be taller than another man by a foot. And he reels off a number of these things, and as you're listening, you're wondering, well, what is wrong with that? Shouldn't it be the case that one can become two by adding one to it? And then shouldn't it be the case that one man can be taller than another man by a foot? And he says, well, how could that possibly work? How could you get something, how would it be possible to get two? How do you get two-ness out of oneness by just adding more oneness to it? And how can you get something larger out of something smaller by adding something even smaller to it? And at first, you're reading it through, and I think it's worth going through the whole list. As you read it through, and you think, well, this is absolutely absurd. You wonder if Socrates is sort of doing kind of a funny game. But he really is getting at something there that's an important exercise, because the exercise there is really demonstrating how much it is the case that we view the universe instinctively from the complete wrong end. And we're so ingrained that there are certain of the things that seem so absolutely normal and common sense to you, but which are as far as possible as you can imagine from the way the actual universe operates. And the reason what keeps us limited to this wrong view is an over-reliance on sense perception in ways that you might not even realize. What I'd sort of like to bring up and to get into the discussion here is to bring up to people as to what extent your conception of time, among other things, is dependent on your sense perception. Now, that might not be an immediately clear thing, or how can that work? How can my sense perception give you time? You might say, okay, well, when people think of being fooled by their sense perception, they normally think of something like an optical illusion. What they mean is that, well, obviously, there's some real universe out there, and my senses just sort of give me some distorted version of that real universe. And if I wanted to get a more accurate image of that real universe, I wouldn't use my sense perception. Instead, I'd use something like a computer. And this is sort of the image that you get from the sci-fi movie. Is the people who agree with you that your sense perception is inaccurate would then say, oh yeah, what I need to do is I need to have some kind of, if I could just get rid of all this messy human stuff. If I get rid of the fact that, I don't see colors right, this ability to have optical illusions. Basically, if I was more of a robot, then I'd be better. Then I wouldn't have any problems with sense perception. I'd see exactly what's out there, wouldn't I? Wouldn't I be recording exactly those real objects that are there? Or you get the same thing. Well, if I were a computer reasoning, I wouldn't make all these mistakes that I make being human. The limitations of my reasoning are that I'm not a perfectly logical computer. And so because I can't always use rigorous logic like a computer, I'm stuck using metaphor, and I've got these things like beauty, etc. And so obviously that makes me much less capable of figuring out how the universe works than I would if I had some other more rigorous high-speed mechanical approach. But the exactly what's being described in those cases is not an escape from sense perception. In fact, it's taking everything that makes your sense perception wrong and turning up the volume on it. And it's ignoring everything that could actually get you away from sense perception. And this is what you're going to find in the well, I'll say the principle, the physical universal principle of metaphor. Metaphor is not something that we have to use because of the unfortunate organic cognitive circumstances that we find ourselves in. Not something we could do away with were we computers. That this is actually something that not only is the reason that we as a species are the only thing in the universe that's capable of reflecting on that universe, understanding it, and then acting in such a way that it responds to our actions. But it's also a principle that exists entirely independent and that precedes the actual human individual. That is, this metaphor as a principle is not something that you find, it's not a principle of human thought. It's a principle of the actual physical universe that we reflect. This is a physical principle. Now, the trouble there is it won't fall into the categories of things that are otherwise simply measurable, but it's completely causal. And again, think back to the seemingly strange discussion that Socrates has with his students in the Phaedo, where he says, well, it's patently obvious, he says, that one has to become two by the addition of two-ness. And it's patently obvious, he says, that something has to become taller than something else by the addition of tallness, not by the addition of shortness. And then again, you're still saying, well, that still seems like sort of odd point for him to be making. But then he elaborates on it. And what he says is, well, if I believed, so this is, you get the image of Socrates laying there, he's in his cell, about to be executed. And he said, if I were to, by the way that book gives explanations, if I were to ask that book why it was that I was laying here on this cot, it would say, well, because my body is composed of a skeleton. Attached to that skeleton, I have the muscles are attached with different kinds of tendons, etc. Those happen to be in a relaxed state, and that relaxed state is what's causing the bones to lay more limply on the cell bed here, and that's why I'm laying here. Instead of saying that I personally, as a mind, saw fit to lay myself here, accept my sentence, and then be executed. And he juxtaposes those two types of causality. Now, the modern version of Anaxagoras' book would say, well, of course it was your mind. It's all those chemicals in your brain, and the way the chemicals in your brain happen to work out in this exact moment because of whatever kind of external stimuli you received, that action in your brain, that condition in your brain caused you a series of electrical impulses. That caused your nervous system to send a signal to your muscles, and that caused your muscles to become relaxed. And the relaxation of your muscles caused your bones to lay limp in the position that they're in, and that's why you're there. So of course, but then Socrates' point is something else, that this is not, he's saying that there's not, that even preceding what you have that you can recognize in the brain, there is another causality there that you identify as mind. Now, again, despite the fact that there's been lots of ink spilled trying to explain that away, that's the whole field of neuroscience right now, is trying to explain mind away and to try and explain mind as an epiphenomenon of, unsuccessfully to explain mind as an epiphenomenon of brain. I think most people have an intuitive sense that there is some them that they identify with, that is their mind, rather than all the secondary effects that derive from mind. But what might not be so obvious is that the point that Socrates makes leading into that, where he's discussing the question of one becoming two, etc., which is that sort of causal principle that you identify with mind is not something that just happens inside the human head. Because there are people who would grant you that. There are people who would say, okay, well, there's this thing called mind, and that's what you deal with when you deal with people. So those become the social studies, right? You deal with people, then you study art, then you study sociology, then psychology, et cetera. Those are that. And those are all strange subjective sciences that you can't really know. You can't be too rigorous about, but they just sort of, you handle those. So that's great, and there's beautiful things about it. Because that's where you find beauty, et cetera. It's wonderful. But when you get down to the cold, hard facts of the physical universe, the rest of the universe, there you have a whole new set of laws that apply. There things either are or they aren't. There's no such thing as actual ambiguity. The ambiguity only arises because you don't know what is or what isn't. There's a very strict kind of cause and effect determinism. And there, logic does reign. I'll grant you that you can't apply logic to human interactions because they're so illogical. And furthermore, you become an unpleasant person if you just operate solely on logic as a human being. So I'll grant that doesn't work there. But once you're out of that domain, once you're into the cold hard science, once you're into the facts of the physical universe, the real meat and potatoes here, once you're into that, then there all your reasoning has to be logical. Everything will eventually everything can be determined. It's all the law of the excluded middle. It's all going to be the case that any statement made is either true or false. And from that, you can derive a mathematics. You can describe the whole universe outside of that. And really, if I really tried, if I could write enough numbers down, I'd actually describe you too. But it would just take a little bit. You're a little mushy, so it takes a little bit to get to that. And then maybe we'll work on chaos theory, and we'll be able to describe a much more complex thing. You're essentially just sort of a funny fractal or something like that. But in opposition to that whole view, I'd like to draw out that this principle you refer to as mind in the human case is actually something that's effective in the physical universe, that so-called objective physical universe where there are no people. And in fact, as we've said before, it will enable us to answer the question of where was human cognition before human beings appeared on the planet? Or again, the related question, where was life before living organisms appeared on the planet? We can answer that with some absolute rigor, and we'll have an approach that we can take to these physical questions that will run entirely opposite to what's called the reductionist agenda, which is the idea that the entire universe is explained once you can explain the behavior of some tiniest element in the small. Instead, we'll get to what we know is the case from human perception, which is that the processes are not explained by the tiniest element in the small, but rather they're explained by the large. Now, how do you explain that? I'll give you one of the favorite examples I'll give you is, if people are familiar with, maybe people watch this guy, Brian Greene's Elegant Universe. He's a book. He's a big proponent right now of string theory. And those funny things, I read through his entire book because I thought the book would be, it just seemed that he said, well, it'd be good to know exactly what is string theory, et cetera. And he progresses. There's this whole long arc where he does the whole history of relativity, quantum mechanics, et cetera, everything leading into how he gets these strings and how they vibrate. And so, it's a whole mess that he kind of goes through. And you're thinking, okay, well, you'll follow it to see what the reasoning is, and it's sort of a mess. And, by the end of it, you're thinking, well, then, but what the hell, why and what are these? Because you think you're going to get to that. And then I like as an example, because at the end of the book, he says, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, why and what are these? And you say, wow, okay, that's great, at the very end of the book, and you're going to answer the question that I thought I had in reading the book. And then he says two things that I think are funny. The first one is he says, for people who know Leibniz, he says, well, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. And again, you're like, wow, I am. And you're wondering, well, if the universe is this way and it's made of these strings, why is it that way and not otherwise? Because this is Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, is that if some set of things are such and such a way and not otherwise, there must be sufficient reason for them to be such and such a way, not otherwise. Otherwise, they'd be otherwise. And that's the basis for you being able to apply reason to the universe at all, because something happened for a reason, therefore you can apply your reason to it. She says, I know you're thinking that. So you're wondering, why is the universe organized this way? So again, you're braced because it sounds like a great setup to answer his own thing. And he says, well, my answer for you is, what if this isn't the only universe? What if there's a multiverse? What if there's millions of universes? Then the reason this universe is the way it is because you're in this one. So you'll never be able to ask the question of why this universe is the way it is. This is just the one you're in. If you're in another one, it would be different. You'd be bleeding fire and whatever and whatnot. You might not have life. That would be different. This one's like this, so don't bother. And then he has a very serious, well, I personally lean towards those kinds of explanations. And then after that, I figured, I'll find at some point we want to assemble a series of quotes on the multiverse, because not only is it seems like the worst cop-out argument you ever heard in your life, but then it is the prominent thing to explain everything. There's a funny thing, and if you look at in cosmology. They have this whole elaborate cosmology, how gravitation causes everything to move the way it's moving. But then once you describe everything with gravitation, things are moving in ways they're not supposed to move. So then you keep adding stuff to it. So they add dark matter to explain some. Dark energy explains other stuff. So you keep adding things you can't see. Then there's another thing called, on top of dark matter and dark energy, there's a thing called dark flow, because there's a bunch of elements of there's a bunch of celestial objects that are all sort of flowing towards one spot in the nighttime sky. And so the official going explanation, and I'll get the articles are funny where people are discussing it very seriously, all these physicists, is that, well, this is the multiverse. And what it is there's a universe adjacent to ours, which is sucking everything from our universe up to the side of it. And therefore you're getting the dark flow. So you've got dark matter, dark energy, dark flow. So anyway, it becomes a very, it's, to make the multiverse thing is a very real phenomenon. But sorry, the point, the reason I wanted to discuss the Brian Greene is because on top of his sort of strange evasion of Leibniz's point for all the string theory stuff, then the other thing he says, well, I know what you're wondering is, now is we went through all this. We went through what, you asked me what living things are made of. And I told you they're made of chemicals. And you asked me what the chemical compounds are made of. And I said, well, those are molecules, they're made of atoms. And you asked what the atoms are made of. And I told you they're made of smaller particles. And then you asked what those smaller particles are made of. And I said strings. And now you're asking me what strings are made of. And well, I know you'd like to know that, but here, what if I asked you instead, what are sentences made of? And I said, well, they're made of words. And then you said, well, what are words made of? And I said, they're made of letters. And then you said, what are letters made of? And I'd say, they're just letters. Well, in the same way as letters are just letters, strings are just strings. And, I'm using it to make fun of the string theory, but the same is true for all particle physics. For any grand theory of everything, you say, okay, you get down to your smallest thing, and it just is. It's like a letter, right? Who could tell you where letters came from? But now, for anybody who's remotely sane, thinking about speaking to somebody, you know that letters come from the desire to communicate an idea to another human being. The first thing that comes first is the idea, is the thing you'd like to communicate, what you want to convey. In order to convey the idea, you figure out how to take that idea, you communicate, turn it into sound, use something in the universe around you to communicate it. You develop words to convey those sounds. You develop letters to convey those words. So properly understood, the proper ontology there, the ontology, I mean the science of reality, would be to say that what are the letters made of? Well, the letters are what are produced by ideas. In a real sense, they're made of ideas. That comes prior to anything else. And you can you get a different kind of ordering instead of the reductionist program, which says you can build things up from the bottom up, which runs into, again, obvious problems with language, though Greene and the string theorists seem to have a difficulty with that as a concept. It's also that exact same problem in language. We'll carry that over to the physical universe in the same way. And we'll make the point that you cannot understand the physical universe by building it up from particles any more than you can understand language by building it up from letters. But now the question then becomes, well, if that's the case, say I'll grant you now that, okay, well, it makes sense that physical universe must, instead of being built from the bottom up, is organized from the top down somehow. What's at the top? Now, we could do the total cop-out argument and just say God, which is fine, could be true, but we won't do that right now because I said it's trivially true. We'll do the point that the mathematician Bernard Riemann made, which is we won't leap to the highest cause unless we have to. We're going to try and do steps to actually see, well, because we want something that's going to actually give you the physical universe the way it is. And it's important to do that because, again, I think you sometimes get these people who claim to be very religious and devout, and and they say that well, I don't worry about all those physics and other things because I'm thinking about God. And in part that's because the physicists have been such creeps that if you want to be divine, you got to kind of run away from it. But then they say, okay, well, say you are being devout, say you're very devout, very religious. God went through a lot of work to put the universe together in a very specific way. It's kind of respectful. To show a little bit of respect, you'd want to investigate why was it organized in the way it's organized and not in some other way. So we won't use that as just a cop-out. You can't just say, that would be as obnoxious as if, you consider yourself a great painter and you came in with your great painting and the person's just like, wow, you You know, you wouldn't, you after a while wouldn't discuss anything with that person any longer. It's something they don't understand about you if they don't understand your attempt to. So we're going to be respectful. We're going to try and say, okay, so how exactly would you get a physical universe organized the way it is, and not otherwise? Organizing the thing, investigating from the top down. So I'd like to just leave that as sort of the context for the rest of this. And then we're going to pursue some other elements, some things we've been looking at to make the point, and then come back to that. Hopefully in the course of covering the arc of a few of these elements, we'll be able to address that question as posed. So to get into this, this right here is a heuristic model that we put together out of work that we'd been doing in the basement, Mr. LaRouche's research team, our research branch. Now, what it was designed to do was to describe, it was developed in the course of looking at an economic process that we'll get to a little bit later. But then it was supposed to be a general heuristic device to describe certain key elements of what are known as anti-entropic processes, or in short, creative processes, processes that actually are involved in developing to higher and higher levels of organization, higher and higher levels of existence, such as, for example, the evolution of the biosphere over time, or hopefully the development of human economic processes and these sorts of things. We wanted to play around with investigating some of these topics. So what we did, what you have here is you've got a set of nested cones. Is it fine if I stand over here? Is that going to screw up the audio for anybody? Yeah, just here, exactly. Pull it out from the sky. Oh, okay. It always looks so cheesy though to walk around holding a microphone, I think. It's a little funny. You feel like an inspirational speaker. So what you've got here is you've got a sequence of nested cones where you can kind of see here. The first one is this one here. It's got a pitch, intersects there, keeps continuing outward. There's a second cone inside of it, the tip is here. That extends outward, intersects the first cone in this cross section here, that circular cross section, keeps going out, intersects a third cone which begins here at another cross section that keeps moving outward. So each one of these are nested and they're intersecting with each other. Now this is to illustrate, to give you an idea of what that illustrates. We're going to apply this as we've been doing, and again, you'll find on the website you'll find more detailed discussion of this applied to evolution. I'm just going to use this one example now to make the point I'd like to make on the top-down organization, top-down ontology. If you take each of these cones and you have it applied to the three major divisions of the history of life on Earth. So let's do that. There's a stretch of time here which is known as the Paleozoic, or the old animal life, old animals. Paleo old, zoic is animals. There's another region which is referred to as the Mesozoic, which is the middle animal life, and then the Cenozoic, which is a newer animal life. Now, each of these are systems. They can consider them periods in the history of life on Earth. Each one has very specific characteristics to it. In fact, I should have brought photos. If I took photos and flashed them for you, you guys would instantly have an emotional cathexis to what each one of these things are. The Cenozoic, if I were to flash it to you, would contain a lot of things that you're familiar with right now. It would look like a nature scene to you. There'd be little furry animals, there'd be trees with fruits on them, there'd be flowers, there'd be grass, deer, whatever. It would look like a normal nature scene. If I gave you a snapshot from the Mesozoic, you wouldn't see any of that. You would see the trees that you would have wouldn't have fruit on them. They wouldn't have flowers. There wouldn't be any grasses. No furry mammals. There would be dinosaurs. you'd see ferns, you'd see cone-bearing plants. You see things you would not see. It would be a whole different shot. If you looked at it, it would look to you like, you know, dinosaur time. You've seen the image. You've seen combinations of those things so much that that whole scene would look to you like it was, you know, the period of the dinosaurs. If you flash back to the Paleozoic, you've got a whole set thing. You'd only see the ferns. You wouldn't see any, definitely no fruit bearing, no flowers. You'd have ferns. You wouldn't have dinosaurs. You'd have sort of large, kind of dangerous salamanders. They'd be very large amphibians as the dominant predators. And then going back further, you'd get other, this would also include sort of a whole period where life is not even on land at all. It's just pure seagoing. And you've got things with only exoskeletons, et cetera, not even internal skeletons. But that goes further back. That we didn't consider for this particular model. We wanted to just pick three key ones, 3 key periods in order to have a, to be able to look at some specific elements. Now, but what's significant about looking at this, the reason we designed it the way we designed it is if you take a look at how each of these cones, so the region between these 2 circles here is the period in which, we'll say, between any of these 2 circles, take these 2 here, the first 2. This is the period in which the Mesozoic life and organization is dominant, is primary. But you'll note that it's not till after this period here that the Cenozoic becomes dominant. But you'll note that even prior to that shift in dominance, you've got the apex of the cone. The apex of the cone actually goes back further into the prior system. Now that's significant because, okay, what happens at this circle here, this cross-section between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic? That cross-section right there is what's known as the KT extinction. That's the extinction where the people know as the extinction of the dinosaurs. There's huge debates as to what must have happened. For right now, it's only significant for us to know that every attempt you make to try and model what happened, you end up with things that aren't enough. For both of these, for the KT and the PT extinction, you end up trying to figure out, you try to use some combination of asteroids, volcanoes, one or the other. There's a big debate between the pro-asteroid grouping, pro-volcano grouping. Each one will tell you why the other one can't work. And I'd say I think they're both right about in each case, it's just not enough to do exactly what happened. But more importantly, it's not enough to give you that increase, the change of system across that, which I'll make the point is a characteristic increase. And a lot of people will argue that you cannot state in evolutionary terms that there's actually any improvement or increase. You can't say better or worse. There's a whole movement of people who they're calling it speciesism, to say that mammals are better than reptiles. And I can get to why they make the argument about why they think reptiles have to be, you know, equal, if not superior to mammals. Well, I'll tell you. It's fine. Because the reason is basically the environmentalist argument, because it's a great thing that you know, why would a reptile be considered superior to a mammal? And you think, well, it doesn't make any sense because, you know, I mean, some people like the pet reptile, but in terms of actual affection being given back to you, you'd be better off with, you know, your rabbit, your cat, your dog, or anything else besides a snake or besides a lizard. In general, there's things that we relate to, and I say it's not just because we happen to be mammals ourselves relating to it. I think there is something to be said about the fact that whatever problems, other problems mammals may have, they got various other ones. There's something to be said about the fact that certain things rear their young and other things don't. Even the fact that, you know, your baby is, you can imagine it's a little hard to be close to the baby. Even though some mammals do have eggs, it's still hard to be close to your baby where it's got it's encased in a shell for much of its development. It's not in your womb. It's not in a crib or anything. It's just sort of the egg and the nest. There's certain things there that make you sort of wonder, okay, there's something's not quite right culturally with the reptiles, and something seems like it's an improvement with the mammals. But then you say, okay, so what's the argument? Why would you say reptiles are better? Well, it's the exact same argument that tells you that it is the greenie argument, the environmentalist argument, because the idea is if you're intelligent and you're conserving, right? We're all supposed to what is it? The reduce, reuse, recycle. That you're kind of pumped with. So the idea is, okay, well, so you have to really conserve because we've got limited resources. There's only so much to go around. So therefore, you turn off your light when you leave the room. You turn off your heater when you leave the room. No point in keeping a room warm that you're not going to be, you're not standing in. So you've got all these rules. Reptiles obey that rule. Reptiles, as long as the environment around them is warm, they'll be warm, they'll go out, they'll do things, they'll operate. When it cools off, they cool off. Right? They sit still, they don't waste, they're super efficient. And in terms of how much waste they pass through when they eat, it's actually, they're also better off than mammals. Mammals are in general pass more waste into the environment, will seem less efficient in certain respects. In some of the just pure metabolic senses seem to be are less efficient. The most extreme case, the one that corresponds to the heater in the room, is the I mean, think about what it means to be warm-blooded. I mentioned this in another presentation, but really think how totally the idea decadent it is to say that no matter what's going on, you're going to keep your body at the exact same temperature. No matter what happens, you're asleep. Is there a reason no matter that you're asleep, you're awake, you're watching TV, you're walking outside, you're jogging, that you're going to do all that you can to keep your body in roughly the same temperature range, and you're going to keep eating and keep metabolizing and processing whatever it takes to keep your body at that temperature all the time? That, well, relatively speaking, that just makes you much less efficient than, your pet snake. So shouldn't that at least count to their advantage? Wouldn't that count? Everything else seems like an advantage, but that's everything else on the mammalian side seems like it's a great progress. But for that one reason, shouldn't you be able to give reptiles a little one up? They're more, again, like I said, they're more like the little spirally Al Gore light bulb than mammals are. The mammals like the incandescent bulb, the reptiles like the cute, whatever, I don't know the other ones. But I'll argue that alone is going to prove that definition of energy efficiency is an inferior definition to the one that appears with mammals. And in fact, from the standpoint of defining the whole later system, that's going to be and again, that portion of it won't get into so much here, but in general, in every respect, the system that you get in the Cenozoic is an advancement over the system that you have in the Mesozoic. But again, back to the question of the fact that the Cenozoic cone extends itself into the Mesozoic. This gets into the neat things, and this gets into our whole discussion, the significant question, the question I want to actually approach here, which is time, how time expresses itself. This is these are a whole set of various animals here. We refer to them all in general as just dinosaurs. These are specific groupings that are picked because within these groupings, and again, to give you the idea of where these cones are. This right here, this late Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, that boundary between those last two is the KT extinction. That's the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. If you subdivide, cut the Mesozoic up, and then cut the Mesozoic up, the end of that is going to be the Cretaceous and the late Cretaceous there. It's the German word for it is where the K comes from. And then this whole period, the Cenozoic, is what's called the Tertiary, which is where the T and the KT extinction comes from. So this is the end of the dinosaurs. And actually not really. A few of them kind of linger on the other side. They found one just recently, last year, that like lingers on way out over here somehow. He's like the last guy left. He just keeps it going. But what's interesting about this, so what's significant about the Tertiary? Again, remember what I said before. What's significant here are mammals become dominant, flowers, fruits. Again, a lot of what you know, grasses, then obviously grazing animals come after you get the grasses. All of these things appear in become dominant in the Cenozoic. If they exist at all in the Mesozoic, they exist in tiny forms. People discuss you've got little tiny mammals, Usually there's a set of tiny little furry things that don't count as mammals, but I'm going to count them anyway. I'm going to count all the furry things as being mammals. Everything else, if it's there, is tiny. If there's a fruiting plant, tiny fruit. If there's it's things that you would be as insignificant as having just sort of the rodents running around. But then, sorry, the whole point is, the other major thing that becomes dominant right then is birds. Birds play a huge role post the KT extension, don't play a significant role prior to it. There's an element, you get the first, well, I'll tell you what happens prior to it. These are various dinosaur lineages. This is a chart showing you which ones of those had feathers. So it's sort of neat to see. And they're grouped by, these are sort of their official groupings of how they're related. So it's taking all of their physiology. So if you were to build a tree to tell you what creature descended from what other creature, this would be how they group themselves into these clusters here. But if you look in entirely different clusters, you have feathers appearing and creatures that are totally, first, groupings that are totally unrelated. And I'll tell you how people try to get around that. And I'll say there's funny stuff. I think the Jurassic Park would have been a cooler movie if you'd actually managed to put the feathers on the raptors. It's supposed to be feathers on them, but they had feathers. But then all these others, these things that are with respect to every other part of their anatomical classification are unrelated, but they all appear. You get these feathers that will appear, and then in some cases disappear. You have later creatures that end up not being feathers. Oh, sorry, all these should be. These all end up being feathered. They're not all. Let me take it all through there. So the question is, well, what's going on that gives you these sort of little explosions of feathers? A few things that are weird about it already. So the first one is that totally unrelated, but they're getting feathers. So the going line right now is, oh, there must have been something right here that they're all related to, and it had some kind of a proto-feather on it. It had something, it didn't, we can't find any other thing that has feathers on it, but it must have had some kind of proto-feather, and it became feathers. First, that's an assumption, that's a solution that's made to fit the assumption. Because you want to say that the way the evolutionary process works is it's deductive, is you can just take, all you have is what your parents had. Maybe you have some kind of accidental evolution, but you don't have anything that would allow it to, things that are totally unrelated at separate locations on the planet, separate times, to develop the same property. But if you look at the evidence straight, that's what seems to be happening. So that alone, that's interesting, curious, kind of, it's to begin with mysterious. The other thing that's mysterious is what the hell were they doing with feathers at this time anyway? Because obviously we think of feathers as being what birds use to fly. But then obviously I think everything else in the Jurassic Park movie might have ended up happening the same way. It just would have been a really pretty thing, hopping around and trying to eat the kids. So obviously a lot of these things aren't using it to fly. Some are. The Archaeopteryx, a number of these other ones are using the feathers to fly. A lot of them aren't. And so it's sort of funny when you describe for each one what the feathers were for. And, you know, some of them kind of make sense. Okay, well, they developed feathers to keep warm. But then the feathers are very specifically designed to keep warm. Some say, well, if it was a seagoing creature, it would be very useful for the feathers. The feathers are useful for seafowl. But then a lot of these aren't seafowl. So the question is, well, why develop it? The one I like is the only one that seems to be universal is that, well, they all develop feathers for mating purposes. I think that one's so funny too, because the idea is, well, okay, what did they do before they had feathers? You bet you it was like, you know, for years, for millions of years, it was very difficult to mate. You know, you couldn't attract the opposite sex, but then, bow, you develop feathers. So first, that already sounds weird, but then the second is, would that really work for us? If one of us was like, man, I'm having such a hard time at the bar, and then pow, you sprouted feathers and came in the next day with feathers. I think people would run from you. It wouldn't. So anyway, it's sort of a funny I think it's a funny argument that they allowed for mating displays, and obviously the mating displays were an evolutionary advantage. But I just can't see how the mating display is such a big help to. In general, I think it's one of the funnier things about the natural selection is you develop the trait that's going to allow you to mate more. And I can't think of any physiological development that you could have, no matter how much it gave you a one-up on your competitors. Again, like even the best, like say you develop like hooks from your elbow so you could scale walls more quickly. Yeah, you might be totally physiologically superior to every other, of your competitors, but I don't think it would help you mate more. I don't think I think it's the exact opposite would end up happening. I don't think you spread your seed more fastly because you could. Anyway, sorry. All that's a funny thing. But then the question is, well, what happens? What's going on in this period? So all this period, what it looks like when you look at it is that you've got a whole period here of what we call research and development before you get the big explosion post-tertiary where you suddenly get this huge diversification of, in fact, only one of these lines. All these ones just die off. So it's not the case that all these feathers make it in, they all become some kind of bird in the tertiary. Most of them just die. And then there's one branch, Avis, that keeps going, becomes not just birds, but then all the birds. That branches out and becomes this whole spread of them. But it's as though on the scale of the whole biosphere, you're getting this test run of bird characteristics. And again, not just feathers, but all the stuff that ends up becoming birds. The location, the development of the wishbone, the hollow bones. There's a bunch of elements that get tested out. This is just to give you feathers, but if you go throughout the thing, there's a lot of other elements that are tested out somewhat independently. The specific way the pelvic bone attaches to the rest of the body. And so again, that's to show you this idea that you've got this is the cone that becomes dominant, but then you've got the apex of it, which exists even within the prior cone, but smaller, in a sort of research and development phase, as though the later state of the system is demanding its existence and anticipating itself by giving you early flashes of itself to begin with. As though you've got something that's evolving, that's developing, but then it's directed in its overall development. Now, again, if we think back to what we did with the sentence, the funny thing is when you think about it from the standpoint of physical science, people get kind of wowed and it seems, well, maybe is this mystical? How could this happen, et cetera? I mean, really, how can anything have an idea of itself happening before it happens? But then if you really think about it, hopefully you do that all the time. Right? Hopefully that's not an uncommon thing. Hopefully most of the things you do, you thought about before you did it. And it's not a shock that is, I don't know what caused me to do that, which is, I guess from the standpoint of free trade, free market economics, that's supposed to be the smartest thing you could do. That if you plan anything, you're screwing up market forces. But if you don't plan, if you just act on your immediate impulse, you're more likely to have things work out statistically for the best. That's somehow the argument. And then they will say, evolution works like that, doesn't it? I mean, really, it's not true. Really? You think the whole biosphere wanted feathers and then spent millions of years beforehand testing out feathers before you got feathers? Obviously, that's not what happened. It was survival of the fittest. The thing that sprouted feathers got to mate more, and then the feathers managed to spread because they were obviously the most useful thing in the environment. But I like it, even looking in the biosphere, you've got that what's happening instead is a lot more like the way I hope most of us use language, which is that you have some idea of what you intend to say and get across, and then you do the opposite of what Brian Greene and the string theorists were saying. You pick your sentence to communicate that idea, then you pick your words to serve the idea, and then the letters hopefully are the last thing you think about. Hopefully, if you're constructing your sentence, it's not just sort of, I like the letter A, and I like the letter T, and then you see what you get at the end of the whole thing. Because then you'd be lucky to communicate anything. I guess they say, they have the thing, if you had 1 million monkeys doing it for 1 million years, you'd get something. I don't know, but no, it wouldn't happen. It definitely wouldn't be what any of the monkeys actually wanted. That would be even if they actually managed to say some sentence, it'd be like, shoot me or something. There'd be no way to actually have your intent expressed by randomly assembling the pieces from the bottom. And so then you can start to say, well, in the evolutionary process, you're going to look at the species, individual species, instead of being something whose individual drive is forming the effect in the large, you're going to be able to, you could say, well, what you've got right here is a process in the large that's demanding the development of the individual species. Actually, I should move along before we get the, what time is it? Let me determine which elements of this I'm going to hit. What time? 4 or 5? Okay, we'll do quickly. We'll skip through these guys with feathers, pictures. So anywho, all that's, what's that to say? Now, we've already made the joke about free trade. I just want to touch on that enough. There's more detailed discussion on our evolution page on the site, going through just really impressive aspects of evolution, using this as a heuristic diagram to discuss, well, how do you get this, the anti-entropy in these biological processes, taking the approach of a scientist named Vladimir Vernadsky to treat the biosphere as a whole as a development, and treat the biosphere as not disconnected from the environment in which it finds itself. One of his most famous books is called the chemical structure of the last book of his life is the chemical structure of the Earth's crust and its environs, where he points out that you can't even understand the development of the biosphere without understanding the development of the entire extraterrestrial environment in which the Earth finds itself. And we'll touch on that just a little bit, but it gives you a sense of the evolution of a system as a system, not as some kind of random free trade, survival of the fittest action among the parts that give you the system as a whole, but instead a single idea that looks more like a sentence than a bunch of, again, jumbled up letters. But why discuss that now? So this gives you the exact sort of the best way to understand a process like that is now to step out of the specifically biological aspects of that process, and to look instead at the areas where that process looks like our sentence, or to look at what we know about the human mind, how the human mind works. And again, to get principled ideas of the human mind, it's better to look, instead of looking at just one individual, we're going to look at the field of economics as a whole, as being the area in which you study human creativity as a phenomenon. Now, this is where Mr. LaRouche has made his most fundamental breakthrough work. To look at, now again, what's argued typically when you talk about economics, people argue that, well, they use the wrong idea of the evolutionary model, the survival of the fittest, building things up from the bottom up, the idea of assembling letters to get to words. They use that to argue for what economic processes should be. And this is where you get the notion of free trade and deregulation, right? The real problem in economy is that you've got all these people who are trying to decide where they think we should be 50 years from now. And that was what we used to do, but then we got over that and we realized that, look, if everybody just does what they want, you're going to get the best thing. If all of us made our own soda and brought it in here and then we just drank the one we want, we would all drink the best soda, wouldn't we? And we'd all get the best soda. The other sodas would die off. They'd go extinct because nobody would buy them. And the only soda you'd have left is the best soda. That's the magic of the markets. That's market economics. And then it gets creepier than when you hear people actually talk about it on the economics shows, because then, it's like, oh my God, that company went under because the markets didn't like it. That's why you're like, wait a minute. It's like, okay, the markets are upset because we're providing too many people with health care. After all, I think the markets sound like a pagan volcano god. It's like, well, really, we have to decide, you're going to change what you decide to do socially because the markets don't like it. And it would be useful to watch how many times people say that, and then watch how many times the solution to appease the markets involves people dying. Because that becomes a very real aspect of it. So that becomes that's taking the survival of the fittest model all the way to its logical conclusion. But if we were to say, well, how do you really get, again, if we were to take what we know about our sentences, you're more likely to get the effect that you want if you try to get the effect that you want. Now, that does require you to know what the effect is that you want and to be right about it. That's true. But that's a difficulty that we adopted the moment we decided we were going to have a republic instead of a monarchy. It's a big difficulty, but it's a real difficulty that, well, somehow everybody in your population has to figure out the right thing to do, or at least the vast majority of them. It's fine. We didn't have those problems when we had a king, but we had other problems when we had a king. So we dumped the king for a reason. So now we've got this new difficulty that you have to be able to say, as a society, you have to be able to determine what direction do we want to go in, and occasionally make mistakes. You occasionally elect a lunatic narcissist for president, and but in general, the idea that you've got the ability to do that and that you have to be right, it's a good development in human society. So this brings us to a discussion of NWAPA. Now, again, I won't go into detail because we've got an extensive report that people can purchase copies of there, the NWAPA 21 report, which again has everything you could possibly want to know about NWAPA. Everything. It's the best thing to kind of get the. It's one of these things. We have it as a pamphlet, but I think it almost ought to be a referenced book because it's got the encyclopedic quality to it. But it's everything you'd want to know about NWAPA as a project. But then all the effects of it. Again, what Rachel went through earlier on. The fact that you've got the immediate areas that are affected by taking a huge amount of the wasted runoff water from this region here of Alaska, northern Canada. And again, make the point, this is wasted water that immediately runs off and becomes salt water. So what we're going to do is, before it runs off and becomes salt water, we're going to make it do a little bit more work. And again, we'll go through, this is the same thing that happens that the biosphere itself figured out how to do. It used to be the case that if you had any rainfall, it landed on the very edges of the continents. And then plants in the Devonian or Silurian, well, at the moment plants decide to move onto land, they did a neat thing, which is they said, okay, fine, water, you can come up and you can rain, you can fall off, but we're going to attract you further and further in. And so they managed to attract by their own evaporation, transpiration, they managed to add more water vapor to the air inland. They turned the rock into a thing called soil, which allowed the soil to hold more water also. So they basically brought the ocean onto land, and they brought rainfall patterns inland. So the same thing was happening. Water's coming up, evaporating, raining, flowing back into the ocean. But now it does it way in here as opposed to just on the very edges. So that's what life does, is life comes onto land. Now we're talking about doing the exact same thing. And this is important, the idea of that you're changing the water cycle. Because you get, the words are used in a funny way. You get often people talk about running out of water. It's really important. You don't run out of water. You don't use up water unless you're splitting it into hydrogen and oxygen and destroying it somehow. Mostly you're passing water through some cycle and it's coming out still as water. In fact, on average, once a droplet of water makes it onto land, once any quantity of water makes it onto land, if the same water will fall about 2.7 times in the form of rainfall before even going back in the ocean. So a lot of that rain you're in is re-rained rain. It's the same rain. The water didn't vanish once it rained. Some of it goes to groundwater. Some of it gets locked up deep underground and it eventually comes back out thousands of years later. Most of it ends up in rivers and just runs back out in rivers after having cycled through soils and other things. If you're in a heavily forested area, you're talking about 8 times or more in rainforests and other areas. So that's the same rain that comes. You can compare that by measuring amount of rainfall and then measuring how much water runs out in the rivers, and you'll see that you've got a difference of 8 times between 0 to 8 times, depending on how much plant life and other things are there. So what we're talking about doing is the water. When I say wasted, I mean the water where the cycle is just like doing a little circle over here, and not going anywhere else. It evaporates off salt water, comes on land, rains back down again, and immediately becomes salt water again. That's not useful. Life recognized that early on, figured out we're going to make it do a little extra work. We're talking about doing the same thing. So the question of bringing this water inland is irrigating. It's sometimes hard to tell from the map. We're not talking about just running rivers through deserts. It's not going to be a desert with a river running through it. You're talking about ending the desert the same way life ended the desert. You're talking about creating the conditions where you're going to increase the amount of rainfall. And we did some investigation of how much you could increase the rainfall in different areas by some amount just happens by having a reservoir there. You increase the amount of rainfall. Some amount happens by just having irrigated cropland. If you selectively decide to create forested areas, you can obviously increase that massive amount. If we are really conscious about where do you want new forests that don't have forests yet, you can get that 8-time cycling to happen there. You can pull rain clouds in from the ocean. You'll be able to actually, what a lot of people look at and call the biotic pump effect. You can get plants to pull water off the ocean over to where the plants are. So this is what we're talking about doing. This transforms everything, not just the region where the water goes, but obviously the construction of this revives our entire Rust Belt again. So you get Detroit going, you get Baltimore, you get Pittsburgh, you get all these areas that have been destroyed in the recent period, Cleveland. This whole region of these destroyed cities, you bring back to life again. And this is what's going to be significant for the district there where Bill's running. You get a huge transformation, but then the question, that on the face of it, you would say has value. And again, it's the value totally outside of supply and demand. Now, the funny thing is once you educate people, then you say, well, they demand it now. But the value did not begin in their demanding it. The value began in the idea. Just like the meaning does not begin in the letters, the value does not come from somebody just demanding it. You create the population that knows what they're able to demand. So you cannot use supply and demand as a metric for it because people will demand stupid stuff if you don't, if they're permitted to just demand whatever they think. You can see. So you have to have a population that's capable of knowing what to plan, and you plan it. But here's the thing, even with all that value there, you could waste NWAPA as a project if you didn't say that, well, what NWAPA is defined by, this is a close-up of that red rectangle here. This is the development we're talking about already with NWAPA in the region of Alaska and Canada, up in the development in the Arctic. So this is the thing. So you're talking about the construction here of a number of not just dams, mega dams. So these are Hoover-style dams. Some are bigger, number bigger than the Hoover Dam. Some the biggest that have ever been created in human history. We've never even constructed any that are this size yet. So think about the level of technology that you're dropping into Alaska and northern Canada. I don't know if people have seen Alaska or northern Canada, but this is a huge leapfrog. So again, the map is a little misleading because it looks like you're just drawing lines on what's already there. But you're talking about creating a level of industry in this region that right now is considered backwards that it's never seen before. So you could just drop a bunch of dams there, or you could recognize that, there's a lot of discussion right now in the news about, will there be a war over the Arctic, the militarization of the Arctic. They're trying there's a lot of propaganda to make the Russian development in the Arctic sound as bad as possible, because there's a resistance, the financial interests, people we refer to as the oligarchy are resistant to the idea of this sort of human development and human progress. So they'd like to make anything the Russians are doing sound as bad as possible. If you really push it, some of the neocons are saying, well, we have to get to the Arctic too. And they mean planting a couple of little military installations, maybe a couple of oil rigs. So they want to treat the Arctic like it's the Wild West frontier and just have a couple of pioneers out there. But now you take a look at what we have in NWAPA, you already have massive industry. Forget about the, I guess there's a couple of, now the TV shows are supposed to get you excited about how, what's this, Arctic Gold, and then there's a couple of these TV shows that would just show you how the wild west of the Arctic is. And there's a movie that just came out which is all about how horrible it is being up there in the Alaska and Yukon. It's only one of these pessimistic ones, and the whole theme of it is why man is the same as an animal, being the title of it. It just came out recently. Give me an idea of the films. But instead, you're saying, well, look, what you're going to do here ought to be the same thing we did with the Imperial Valley in California, right? That's the place now where the vast majority, the majority of our crops and fruits are produced in the U.S. is a desert, was a desert. You take the most backwards area, you make it the most forward-looking. So now you do the same thing here. You take this region here. You've got a window now into the Arctic, not just to plant a couple of oil rigs, but to build a whole industry. And if you take into account the fact that the Russians are talking about developing their Far East at the same time, so you've got to I'll do this map maybe it's a little clearer first. So the Russians, this is the top view, North Pole down, are talking about developing their north and their Far East At the same time as we're talking about NWAPA developing Canada and Alaska, suddenly this view here, you can kind of see, this puts Alaska now not as the most farthest frontier part of the planet that you can never get to. Why would you ever go there? You can only land on a private landing strip by your own house, etc. Now instead, this is the center of the world. Because if you talk about, if we complete what we could easily complete, which is the Bering Strait crossing, which the Russians have already just built their rail up here to Yakutsk already. They've just finished that rail line. So they're open to the idea already of moving all the way up there. With NWAPA, we get put up here, we get positioned in Alaska already. Suddenly, Alaska and northern Canada, Western Canada, this is the center of the planet. You drive through there on your way from Argentina to South Africa. You know, on your way from New York to Tokyo, you drive through Alaska. Now I could do the whole sales pitch and all that, why this is so much better than spending 3 hours in the airport, flying over, not being able to see anything out the little window, and then landing and spending 3 more hours in the other airport. Why it's so much better to get on a train, have a nice scenic trip across all of this territory. Anyway, you can read a book. You're not squeezing a little, there's 100 reasons why, but I won't do the actual pictures. In general, this is better. In general, rail is just better than flying anything. Mainly for this reason, because along the route, you develop things. You don't build new cities along airplane routes. There's not much of a reason to do so. You don't build a new city you're going to fly over. But if you're going to take a train through some area, you're likely to say, suddenly you've got the ability to lay communication lines underneath that rail track. You can lay, you can take all kinds of other gas, other pipelines, power generation along that rail. You build arteries. These are best conceived of as arteries, not just transportation routes. So that becomes the center of the world. So that's great. So if you're thinking from that standpoint, that step beyond NWAPA, that next system beyond NWAPA, but you have that as a seed crystal. So before you've even got NWAPA there, before you even got NWAPA, oops, I'm too far backwards. Here we go. Before you even got NWAPA, so you got the period in which NWAPA is defined. We're constructing it. That's dominant. In it, you've already got the seed crystal of your Arctic development. That defines the value of NWAPA. That later state defines the value of your prior state. You're allowing the future to define that later one. So that by itself seems great. But now, what if, and we've been using this as an example, but anything could be used. But there was some, in a recent forum they had on Arctic development in Russia, they proposed a city for this island here, Kotelny, and inside the Arctic Circle. So on this island, building a city. Now, you could build all kinds of cities out there, and they'd just be very cold cities. Or you could decide to make a warm city, maybe try to put a dome or whatever, have heating, etc. What we liked about this model here is that it wasn't just a city, not just a warm city or a slightly warmer city, because there's been proposals in the past for domed kind of warm cities so you just don't die in the Arctic. But it's still very cold. Instead, the architect here took the design of the International Space Station and then expanded it to be something that could be where you'd have a development on land where it would be, so here in the middle of the Arctic Circle, you'd have a city for your workers doing all kinds of other mining, et cetera. Everything the workers, the researchers are doing there will be inside a city that's as temperate or more temperate than LA, Los Angeles, which is has unfortunate problems. The city has all kinds of problems, Los Angeles, but it produces some good things, and it's got wonderful weather. So if you could overcome those other problems, and you could figure out how to get that same weather transplanted to the Arctic Circle, which is what you're talking about with something like this, and even better because this one's totally defined yourself. Everything's defined. You don't have smog, nothing like that. You've had a leapfrog, and you created conditions that are better in the most backwards area than you ever had anywhere else that was forward. But then the better thing is, the point which is exciting is that the kind of construction you're talking about here, the architect got excited about, likes to make the point that the construction you would use there in the Arctic, if done correctly, you'd use the same kind of construction there in the Arctic as you would use on the surface of the Moon and on the surface of Mars, or underneath the surface of the moon or Mars, depending on what you want to defend yourself from what conditions. So what you're doing in the Arctic is not just developing the Arctic any longer. So not only is NWAPA not just NWAPA is the Arctic, then you have to create the conditions where not only the Arctic is not just the Arctic is the moon, the kind of development you'd have on the moon. And so again, each of these systems is looking forward to the one that comes from the next. And the fact that that later one exists increases the value of the one that came before. Right? This is the exact opposite of impulsive supply and demand. You're using the long arc to lend value backwards to prior systems. Then ultimately what you develop on the moon properly done economically becomes your launch pad for developing Mars and the rest of the solar system. And we can go, there's 100 reasons, a wonderful presentation given at our conference in Berlin going through why you'd want lunar development, but I'll give a simple one I mean, there's all kinds of wonderful things you can do with the vacuum, low gravity, et cetera. But if you're going to have a way station to launch ships to Mars, you're going to want to start on the moon with lunar gravity. It's just more efficient. And the reason we have these giant rockets to get off Earth is because Earth is really big and has a lot of gravity, and it takes a lot of rocket to get off the planet. The moon's much smaller, much less gravity, takes a lot less, like a third. It takes a lot less rocket to get off the moon. Much better for a regular way station back and forth. It's sort of our continent came with a port built in. It's just great, and really built in. I feel like we've been missing the hint for so long. It's sort of, we traveled to the New World from Europe, where you couldn't even, you don't see the U.S. from Europe, but you see the moon from everywhere. You always look at the moon anyway. The moon is like that much closer. The moon is, we're talking about developing up to Russia. The moon is, at least in terms of in the immediacy in your mind, that's a lot closer. My distance, whatever. But so the idea is that, so then the actual value of something like NWAPA is its role in mankind's overall extraterrestrial imperative via this whole route through the Arctic region, et cetera. So you've got, again, that the idea is physically you want to allow for the future to act on the present. That is the notion of a credit system. And it's really important because the idea, people think of credit system as a different kind of monetary system. It's not. The credit system is, you're saying, well, if the value of this thing in the present is defined by some state that far in the future, if really physically the value of this thing in the present is defined by something that's so far in the future we're not even looking at, we're not even giving a chance to work on it yet, then you've got to somehow have your system organized so that that can happen, that you can allow the future to act back on the present. Right now, in a monetarist system, it cannot. The idea of monetarism is the future is not allowed to act on the present. That's the purpose of it. The whole idea, I mean, the simple expression of it is the fact that, you can't, the stock market, the word investment has been so perverted and sullied by what's been done with it. The idea that you can invest in something for an afternoon. You can invest in an hour. That I invested in something today and then I sold it tomorrow. You can try doing anything like to raise your kids like that. It's like, yeah, I had kids for 2 hours. I invested for 3 days and I got bored and I decided to sell it because I knew I'd make big money on some other kids. But you can't actually, there's no way you can't have progress if that's your economic system. If value changes from day to day, progress depends on, the real meaning of investment, the idea that you're going to allow that future state, you're thinking, well, at some point you're going to be a wonderful adult. And you're going to do good things for society, so I'm going to spend at least 18 years making sure you become a wonderful adult. And, that's your investment. Your future is determining the significance of the thing right now. It's not whether or not the kid cries too much, it gets on your nerves at this very moment. But then your whole idea of a credit is there's an ontological significance of the credit system, which is that kind of time, which is not a simple time that flows from the present into the future. It doesn't just flow backward to forward. It's a time that flows also from the future into the present, which we could discuss a lot more. There's an actual ontology to that, and I'll argue that that notion of time will be the notion that will allow us to solve some of the more fundamental problems in physics, dealing with the quantum, dealing with some other areas. That is not, again, this is not just something that people do. This is not just something that's in the domain of cognition. If you can master this in the area of cognition, it'll have huge spillover effects into the domain of the so-called lower sciences, like physics, et cetera. But we don't have time for that now. this is just sort of to give the promo of what we're talking about, what we mean when we're discussing making fundamental breakthroughs in economic science. So you'll find this more elements of this more elaborated in the Wednesday weekly reports we've been having. On the biological side, we've got a lot on the evolution page. I was super sloppy with it here, but we'll have it's a lot more refined there and more to come. And then a lot, obviously, of the economic development you'll find available. The NWAPA 21 report, a lot of these will be there available for you to look at. Some of the stuff you can get as snazzy posters. There's a snazzy poster of this guy. It's great. But it's got all the development, the whole picture of the Arctic development. But that's what we got. That's the discussion. So there's some questions, I guess. Oh, sorry. Actually, what should we do? Yeah, maybe. Sorry, I'm pointing at people, and we have to have some kind of more organized process here.
Thank you. The zone after the Cenozoic, after the Cenozoic, if you will, is it likely to contract? In other words, it would go down to the size of the Mesozoic. Can you project that out in some sort of a? I don't want to use the word lot.
Yeah, the way it contracts, if you just take the historical, just the pure empirical arc there. If you look at the difference between the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, the image is roughly, this one's roughly to scale. It's contracting it contracts in time, the amount of time spent on each one. This is on the order of, let me say, you're talking to, I'm going to get the exact numbers here. I don't have it here. But it's from like billions, like 250 million, then shorter, you just keep like 60 million, 60 million, 250 million, couple of billion. So it's contracting over time. So this growth, the sort of the increase here and the increase in the rate there is a real one. We have another image I didn't bring here, which if you were to divide the Cenozoic up after man appears, and you were to start discussing metabolism, again, obviously, your first side as well, we don't have a different metabolism an amazingly different metabolism than a higher ape or something like that. But already with the introduction of fire, mankind's metabolism is outside of mankind, right? You do a lot of your chewing, you're doing on the skillet, et cetera. A lot of most of your organism is more than your organism. So for humankind, you end up having to include the entire economic process as that sort of metabolic process. Mr. LaRouche has a wonderful metric for that, which he calls energy flux density. And a good proxy for that is to look at the amount of energy produced, the amount of heat produced in calories for a given volume of your fuel. And if you were to do the same thing, and you could order it by wood, and then coal, and then coke, the more concentrated coal, and then other fossil fuels like petroleum, et cetera, then nuclear fission, then nuclear fusion. If you look at those, you'd have a steady increase among those of energy density of all those energy resources. And if you look at the amount of time we spend on each one, it contracts even further. The rate of contraction here is faster and faster. We spend most of our existence, as a species burning wood. Then suddenly you get a switch to coal. We spend a much shorter time on coal. Then you get the switch to coke. It compresses. The rate between the breakthroughs increases. And then the first time that pattern gets broken in the history of the biosphere or the history of human development is when we fail to go full tilt with the nuclear fission economy because of all the environmentalist propaganda, and we fail to develop nuclear fusion. It's the first time that rate starts to slow down. Now, I'll point out that that slowdown of that rate corresponds to what happens at one of these collapse points, at one of these extinction points for other animals. We're in the middle of what will be the equivalent of a collision back to that extinction point. We've gone through that in other presentations. But the rate of time should be what we can intuit from the whole history of the biosphere, but also human activity, what's required to keep us alive. That rate should be steadily increasing, the rate between discoveries, which you can imagine would happen. If you've got a real healthy society, more and more people are becoming educated. Your population is increasing. You've got a human population that's now colonized, say, the whole solar system or beyond, and hopefully you'd have what you would need to do that, which is incredibly high educational level, standard of living. The amount of breakthroughs that you're talking about there, the amount of fundamental breakthroughs coming from human individuals is going to be beyond what we can even imagine right now. I mean, for us, if you get one major scientific breakthrough in a generation, we're happy, right? And you live on that one forever, and then it becomes cemented, and you hang it on your wall, and then nobody can say, well, how did that ever happen? Where did Einstein come from? You know, you talk about Einstein all the way into the next generation. But if you've got a real developed society and you've got a population spread through the solar system, you should have a density of that kind of breakthrough. You're ending up talking about, 2, 3, 4, hundreds of those in a lifetime. So some of it becomes hard to imagine, but in general, that rate will increase. So I don't know if there's more from here or abroad. Oh, I think you've been cut off. Oh, what from here? Or? I thought we could give the mic. On a number of different levels. If you take, again, if we take this arc of development, leave it here. If we take this arc of development as we've seen it here in the biosphere and then the one I just described, if you look at solar energy, it goes backwards in a number of different ways. One, in just pure energy density, it goes back. The amount of, again, solar energy, you're talking about the amount of energy if you use LaRouche's concept of energy flux density, you've got as much energy from solar energy as the heat from the sun, as the electromagnetic energy from the sun falls on a certain cross-section of area on the surface of the Earth. That's incredibly tiny compared to nuclear energy. In fact, if you think about what the other fuel sources were before that, like petroleum, think of petroleum, think of all fossil fuels, think of wood. Those were originally that solar energy, but it was condensed and upgraded to a much higher form. So plants do the best work with solar energy. If you want to use your solar energy for something, the best is let plant and animal life have it. Because then that pumps itself into the biosphere. That ultimately becomes very energy dense forms of material. That gives you all of your fossil fuels, everything else like that. That's the best use for it. And then there's other reasons why you don't want to not give it to plants. It's sort of funny if you picture, there's this plan, what's called desert tech, where there's an argument. A bunch of the greenies are saying, well, the best way to there's all these problems with solar energy. Why don't we just take all the deserts and cover them with solar panels? Because that way, that way we'd finally have the surface area we need to get electricity. Now compare that to Nawapa. I like to compare at some point we'd have one of our artists do an image of it. Compare the image of Earth from space under Nawapa. So all your deserts become green. You've got this giant, beautiful, verdant planet. Compare instead a planet with desert tech, where you cover all the deserts with solar panels. We look like Cybertron. You got the big metal planet floating through space. If you've ever seen any of these dystopian future images of a giant metal planet, that's your solar panel one. But okay, there's all the safety problems of fires, etc., and those are real ones. But I'd say those are all real. They have the issue of there was a report of in San Fran and other places in Germany that you had any houses that had the solar panels on top, the firemen won't come and put the fire out because it's a hazard for the firemen. They'll get electrocuted. But the more interesting part, I think, is if you take it from the standpoint of what we've done here, of viewing the systems, how the systems develop, it's actually a step backwards. And in fact, if you examine the system, remember what we said before here, the end of the Mesozoic is not just the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's the end of the entire system. The Cenozoic is not just the introduction of mammals, it's the introduction of an entire system that comes along with it. If you think about the development of nuclear fission is what Mr. LaRouche calls a platform. There's an entire system that gets introduced there. It's not just the fission power. It's not just how much electricity does it produce. You want to know beyond how much electricity it produces, you want to know what else comes out of this. Out of nuclear, you get medical isotopes. You get a whole nuclear age that comes with nuclear fission. If you were to move to nuclear fusion, you get not just power generation, but you get fusion transportation, which is that would give you the kind of specific impulse that we need to actually get to Mars in a reasonable amount of time. Only with fusion could you ever have that. You get technology, as what Rachel discussed earlier. You did mention the fusion torch, didn't you? The fusion torch technology, which allows you to reduce any material to its constituent elements. You know, you can reduce elements to their other elements. The piece. You can reduce them. You can convert. You know, you get the, what the alchemists only dreamed about. So there's a whole technological platform there beyond just the energy generation, which is why it becomes misleading even when you get the environmentalist arguments trying to argue that, well, we could get good energy density from solar. First, it's not true. It's dangerously low. But then second, there's no other platform that comes with it. And then third, it would be an ugly planet. It's a hideous planet. Have you ever seen these the solar panel, solar farms, or the wind farms? The hideous, most hideous things you ever see. At least on a nuclear power plant, you can grow plants on top of it. Have you seen them? You can grow if you cover your nuclear power plant in vines and moss, it works fine, looks beautiful. If you take a solar panel field and grow vines and moss on top of it, there's no more power coming out of the solar panel field. You cannot have plants near solar panels. Anyway, so for all those reasons. What are we going to do from here, or somebody maybe handle the mic? Or okay, great.
Sky, if you have a dish the size of the Earth, would that be collecting enough energy to supply, the needs for progress in Earth?
I don't know. I don't know if we have enough material on Earth to make it, though.
But I mean, in that sense, for area, a nuclear power plant will be much more efficient.
Yeah, no, the nuclear power plant is more efficient in terms of area, but then I'm glad you bring it up. Also, in terms of materials, that's the important thing, because this is again the big fraud, among other frauds. There's a lot of frauds, but the idea that this is that wind and solar are renewable energy, is well, wind just keeps coming, right? You never use anything else, but then it's just true. Solar panel windmills are not made from wind. You have to produce them out of all kinds of other materials. It takes a lot of resources to make a windmill. If they were made of wind, it would be great. If you could make it out of wind and then wind blew it and then powered it, then it would be totally free energy, et cetera. If your solar panels were made out of sunlight, that would be excellent. But they're not made from sunlight. They're made from materials that you have to mine. You have to hire people to do it. You have the limited. They're a limited resource as much as anything else. There's no way to get around using a resource. The question is the amount of material that you use worth what you get out of it? And like you're saying, for a nuclear power plant, obviously you get a nice encapsulated amount of the actual volume of materials for what it puts out is just more efficient than what you would get from any of the other so-called types of green energy. So that's just as a simple, and the amount of people who are employed in it, the educational level that's required for it, and then what sorts of, anyway, the funny one about the desert tech thing is that if you get dust on a solar panel, its efficiency is reduced by like 40%. So you picture how many people you hire to just dust the solar panels. It seems like a bad use of labor. Maybe somebody will invent the auto dusting when you have wipers on it or something like that. But either way, it's sort of a problem. And what better place to get dust on your solar panel than putting it in the desert? So all the places you would want to put it is where it's going to get dusty. The places where it wouldn't get dusty would have plants, but you can't have plants because solar panels can't have the plants. So. Say what? Yeah, right, exactly. Exactly, yes, it's just not good conditions for it. And if you're going to cover the whole Sahara, I wonder who the guy is going to be who hikes his way to the middle of it to dust that one. Anyway. You want to talk about dystopian future, you picture these corpses lying next to this giant metal desert. Anyway. Any aliens that came to want to visit us would be blinded by the fact of our just big reflective side. That would be very unfortunate circumstance. Is there one here? Did you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Oh, here you go.
What about nuclear waste from these facilities?
That there's a couple of things. First, for a long time, nuclear waste hasn't been an issue. The whole idea of waste reprocessing. In general, I'm going to do a super simplistic version of it, which is if it's radioactive, it's fuel. So the idea that something's wrong if you're taking something that's still radioactive, producing heat and dumping it underground. So there's all kinds of reprocessing facilities to figure out how you can get more out of it. But then there's ways to organize it. I remember for a while, a couple of people had for our table organizing, would carry pieces of the nuclear waste from these pebble bed reactors, because the newer models, that's just not the actual so-called waste is not even something you'd bury. You could wear it as jewelry. So it's just, the question is, well, that actually those produce less radiation, and the graphite shell around them, they don't produce any radiation almost at all, less than you would get from just walking on the sidewalk, which leaves you a lot of radiation. But then second, frankly, even if you just got a piece of uranium as a necklace, you'd probably be healthier than did you not have it. There's a lot of work on what's called radiation hormesis, which is the health benefits of low-dose radiation, showing that low-dose radiation is actually people who are exposed to large amounts of low-dose radiation tend to be healthier and live longer than people who aren't. Say what? Yeah, right. Well, right now, we do get exposed to a lot. Frankly, most of the radiation you get straight from either terrestrial sources, just the ground you walk on, and then what you get from galactic sources would be much higher than you get even standing near a nuclear power plant. But if you can increase that just slightly, like some people who live at high altitudes, who get more of the cosmic radiation, or people who live near other kinds of, they tend to be overall healthier, which is sort of what you'd expect. I mean, it's sort of, the theory of radiation, even the one that you use to discern how much can you be exposed to in your whole life, is a theory called the linear no threshold theory of radiation. And there's a beautiful interview on our website with somebody who did a lot of research on that and going through how that fraud was introduced. The idea is that, okay, well, radiation is deadly in large amounts, so it's just kind of harmful in small amounts, which is what we've been sort of drilled with, which is, funny for anything else, that, water is dangerous in large amounts, but it's not therefore kind of dangerous in small amounts. Right? Anything else like that. Vitamin C is very bad for you in large amounts. All vitamins are very bad for you in large enough amounts. But that doesn't mean that in small amounts they're just kind of harmful. I guess sort of. Somebody always made the joke that, every breath you take reduces your life by 1 second. The amount of life you have left to live by 1 second, which is sort of true, but it doesn't mean you should therefore stop breathing. But it's not. So the idea, but the theory, radiation was the first time, and they had a whole theory about why it was true, that in large amounts you'll get radiation poisoning and die. So therefore, small amounts you're getting a little bit of radiation poisoning. But then it also turns out not to be true for radiation either. That the small amounts, like most other, and there's been some study done, a lot more study to be done on how they are helpful. There's a lot of work done on, we've done a lot of articles on things like irradiated food. If you expose fruits and other things to low-dose radiation, the large organism, the fruit, is unharmed. The smaller ones are killed off. So the bacteria will stay fresh. And I don't mean not preserved, but actually fresh. Just nothing is going to grow on it for much longer than the non-irradiated fruit. So there's a lot more we could be doing with it. Again, the other thing is a lot of that nuclear waste, we're running out of isotopes, a lot of which would be byproducts of nuclear power plants properly designed. You design your nuclear power plant so that the product you produce is a radioactive material useful for something else, like medical isotopes, medical imaging, and things like that. We don't have a shortage. We're importing from, I think, Canada and I forget elsewhere for, France, okay, for the medical isotopes. So we've got a, in general, it's you change the word from nuclear waste. There's stuff we want to use. That stuff you want. And and I'm opposed to just burying it in a mountain too, because it's a waste. Why would you bury anything in a mountain? It's like burying food in a mountain because it's too much. And it's like, oh my God, these trees are producing all this waste. We have to bury it in a salt flat somewhere. The reasoning seems to be as bad to me. But again, there's a lot more on the site. Again, I'm giving some of these things. I'm giving the sloppier version because we've got people who do much better. So you got the, but the interview is with I'm getting his name, Calabrese. Yeah, C-A-L-A. Yeah, it's on our site. If you do a search on the site for that, it's a wonderful long interview. He's got a lot more. Anything else? Is that it?
My name is Gilbert. Mercado. I got a question about Nawapa. Now, I'm for it. I think it's a great plan. I just got a question, the one concern. If I was living in that part of the part of like the banks of the Mississippi and dealing with those spring floods, my concern about Nawapa would be placing those reservoirs in the path of those storm centers that come from storm fronts that come from the Pacific and cross into the Atlantic and cause those floods in the Mississippi. What effect would that increase in moist of bodies of water have on those storm fronts?
Well, in general, on the fronts themselves, you can play around. Probably minimal. You'd engineer the effect you want to have on rainfall itself. That would have to be consciously engineered. And again, like I said, it wouldn't be so much from the reservoirs themselves. It would be from deciding where you put forests and other things like that. So you could engineer that to a T. And in fact, this would be the first time we perfected that as a science if we did it carefully with Nawapa. But on the question of flooding, the more important thing than the rainfall is the dam control, river control. If you want to prevent flooding, the building of dams itself will prevent the flooding because then you can adjust. You adjust how much. So you adjust river heights. Where you have dams, you no longer have downriver flooding any longer because you adjust the reservoir height, et cetera, to control it. That would be the way to deal with it. You heard in the Nawapa video, they made the point, I leaned heavily on places that don't have enough water. They made the point that you've got two problems. You've got places that have too much water, you have seasonal flooding, et cetera, and places with too little. The point of a water management system is not just to get water to the places with not enough water, it's to be able to immediately reduce the amount of water and moderate it in the other areas. So this would talk, you're talking about moderating the entire, really the original idea of constructing dams was so you can moderate, is the moderation of this entire system. So you prevent the flooding by acting on the flooding more directly. Again, less significant than the rainfall would be your ability to actually control the volume of the river itself. Actually, say it again with the microphone, so we have it on the...
After World War II, there was the launching of a system of control, which was one of the early follow-ups to the TVA, which starts with that Missouri River Basin, which is what flooded 2 years ago in Missouri and floods every few years, which is from ice melt in Montana, which was exceptional. And it came down 2 years ago, and everybody saw this devastation, which knocked out, and the Obama administration did absolutely nothing to deal with the circumstances. But it was a year ago that happened. But that's the second 15 years. And there was a system that was half built, I forget the name of the Pike something or other, named after a couple of senators, which was half built and mainly completed in the southern part of the United States as sort of a spin-off of the TVA, but not completed in the northern part. You wouldn't think that would have happened, but it actually did. And so there's actually been an operational blueprint, which everybody knows would handle this, that's been sitting there only half completed since about 1946. And the reason that that's included on the Nawapa map is because the idea is that as you're building Nawapa, you would take care of that and do the other thing, which is replenish the Ogallala aquifer. In other words, there's an aspect of Nawapa is not just the straight line from Alaska down to Mexico. It also goes into the central core of the United States where our grain is grown, all the way into Minneapolis, and deals with some of these residues of Missouri flood control, of Mississippi flood control.
All right. Cool.